the time that we have in this existence in order to prepare ourselves for what comes after this existence. It definitely should not be to cause anyone to despair to the extent that they question whether they want to go on in this existence, because every piece of data we're going to talk about definitely indicates that that would be the wrong choice. And so if you suffer from any of those issues, again, we love you, but this is not the right space for you, and please take care of yourself first. So the reason that I chose the Doom Room to open up this conversation is because the the listeners, the I don't know, fans, audience, the consistent audience, it's like, I think it's a lot of fans of conspiratainment and people who are sort of entertained by dark, doomerish scenarios. They might take it seriously. They might be preppers. They might. I'm not saying everyone there is just there for the entertainment, but I'm saying that that is, I think, a factor with a lot of the people who tune into a space like that. And so, as a matter of safety, it seemed that that particular audience, the Dream Rooms audience, would be the best place to discuss these topics. And as it turned out, that was absolutely true. People were responding that it was the best Doom Room space they had ever heard. So that shows you, like, they were getting a certain amount of entertainment and gratification out of, like, the doom aspect, right? They're like reading horror novels or like dark sci-fi novels, that type of audience. um, and the next day, UFOX was, I mean, every space had the topics we discussed as the topics of their space. Now, they didn't discuss the topics that we discussed. They didn't discuss us, mention us, name us. And when I went there, there was no recognition of who I am. So I don't think anyone involved in organizing those spaces had actually listened to our Doom Room space. I think that they were just, they saw an opportunity. They saw some, people were talking about it. It had had an impact. And so, they wanted to jump on the train. And I'm not trying to say that in a disrespectful way. I'm saying that's a good marketing, right? That's exactly what you do when you try to market something or promote something, a space, a podcast or whatever. It's not, anyways. Uh, except what I did not anticipate. I anticipated that few people would pay attention, and that was okay because even though we're serious about disseminating this information, it was sort of like putting our toes in the water, right? Like, sort of easing into it. So there wasn't any expectation. I did actually think maybe about 3,000 people, and that's, in the end, that's going to be about what it is. But what I didn't factor in was were all the people connected to UFO and Doomer X space who would editorialize on what we talked about without ever having listened to it. And that caused a little bit of concern. The next couple of days, I saw some posts from Skywatch, I think is the name of the account, the handle on the account. And they were like, okay, let's talk about these soul traps. And then they started to give people advice about how to handle an after death experience without any source material. Like, you might not believe that our sources are reputable, or one might not believe that our sources are reputable um, because of people's personal beliefs about remote viewing or esoteric history. But we do have sources, and what I found was at least one individual with 25,000 followers, just sort of shooting from the hip, and I saw in a number of cases people using this term, which was a really poorly applied metaphor, um, or a poorly applied, like, cultural belief, and they were saying, "Well, this is all consent based," and what we're talking about is nothing related to um, the Me Too movement in the United States of America, Western civilization in the last 10 years. Uh, Obviously, no one is challenging the advances that we've made in, in recognizing consent in our society, but being imprisoned is not consent based. And telling people, well, this is all consent based, so don't worry about it, it undermines what we're trying to talk about. So I wanted to set the record straight on that. And then a few people did actually ask. Although, like I said, most people just sort of talked about the fact the space had happened. A few people did ask, like, what does the data specifically show? So we wanted to go over that as well. And again, I just want to state for the record that that the reason I wanted to go on the record was to draw out and put the individuals who have this information, who choose not to disseminate it, or have, and then have removed that information from public view. I wanted this to be on the record so that they sort of had to go on the record themselves. Yeah, so that's the reason that we chose the Doom Room specifically. And so now we're gonna try to fix and go over any misunderstandings that might have happened. You got anything, Morgan, or should I move on to the next part? Or
well, no. But speaking of the Doom Room,
go ahead.
Hey,
friend.
Hey, Doomer.
Hey, Doomer.
Hope you guys are having a good day.
Hey, Margie. I was just letting everyone know that the reason that we felt it was the right group, the right space to bring these issues forward was because of your specific audience and their specific interests. What we inferred were their specific interests made it less likely that they would suffer strong psychological distress from the content. And that, for me, what was really important was getting the information on the record in order to encourage other people to go on the record as well about this seemingly commonly understood information in the remote viewing community. The next issue that came up was whenever you have information like this, people with strong religious beliefs can feel challenged by the information, and they can also feel that you're attempting to evangelize them to leave their faith and accept information that is outside of their faith. And I don't know Morgan. I haven't known him my entire life, but we have gotten to know each other. And I don't think that's anything that's any part of his nature at all. I can say Dan, the other remote viewer that we had on, it would be the furthest thing from his nature and his interests. And specifically, I would never want to undermine someone's religious faith. And the reason that I would never want to do that is that this information came forward in the axial age, the period where all of these ethical religions were beginning. And I am fairly certain that this is information that underlies all of these religious faiths. And by all these religious faiths, I mean Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, maybe not Judaism. I can't say with authority about whether that's the case or not. I think that there were multiple things going on there. It certainly is information that was available through astrotheology and henotheism in Greece and Rome. It certainly is information that was available through the Stoics and the Platonic philosophers. It certainly is information that was available through the Hermetic movement, and of course, it's definitely information that was represented by the Christian Gnostic movement. So I really believe that this information underlies the basic religious beliefs that the various faiths have, and so causing someone to question or leave their faith, which wouldn't be possible anyhow, because there's nothing that we're going to say that's going to do that. But if that was our intention, that would be extremely counterproductive, because it would separate people from the very system lever motivation. I don't know if I'm picking the right words, that they would have to move forward with this information and hopefully change their life, for the better, to try to get out of this situation. I know I'm not being that articulate. So yeah, there is a large variety of beliefs about what is and is not acceptable Christian theology and behavior, and information. I I run into people all the time who, or I have in the past, I don't anymore, run into people all the time who wanted to inform me about what Christians do or do not believe. Um, in my experience, they don't read the New Testament. I think we all know, if we've been paying attention today, that yesterday or the day before, a U.S. senator claimed that we have to go to war in the Mideast, um, if we're true Christians, because that is what he believes the Christian religion commands him to do. And he mentioned the Old Testament. He was told that in the Old Testament it said something. And again, this is exactly what I'm saying. People who say those things don't read the New Testament. They don't. They certainly never um, cite it to support their arguments. And so the specific feeling that some people have that this information might be an attempt to undermine Christian faith. I'm a Christian. I don't believe this undermines the Christian faith. I believe that if you read the New Testament word for word, as opposed to what people say about it, it is a description of this very thing. I know that Jesus said he came to set the prisoners free, right? And I'm not going to talk too much about religious faith because we're going to focus on the data, but I just want to get this out in the beginning. I can cite specific places in the New Testament, 1 Peter 3:18 to 3:21, which I would cite as support for the fact that this information is in the New Testament. So I definitely am not out to undermine people's New Testament based Christian religious faith. All right, so Morgan, let's go back now, and just establish for everyone that we're talking about um, the archons. We're talking about the ancient idea that we're living in a illusory reality, right? You and I talked, and instead of saying prison planet, prison reality would be a more accurate term. What Without completely rehashing all the information, um, what would you say the data says is our situation? If you could summarize it for people who might hear this and have never heard the other spaces.
Oh, okay, sure. Let's see. Try and be as brief as I can, but
Mhm.
more or less, our data tells us that at some point in time, um, presumably well into the creation and the playing out of things as they were in reality and I guess, on Earth. At some point, um, we'll just call them outsiders. Some outsiders came along and exerted great influence over the natural order of things, I guess would be the simplest way to put it. And they engaged in what we would, in modern times, refer to as a genetic engineering experiment on the native inhabiting life forms of the earth. They basically genetically engineered those creatures into what we would consider modern man today, Homo sapiens sapiens, for apparently a wide variety of purposes. One, probably chief among those, was as a source of energy for their technologies. Now, as another part of that, it seems as though they have somehow, again using kind of modern nomenclature, they basically neuralinked us together and put us into what I would probably call something akin to a shared induced dream. And that's the the prison reality that JT referred to a moment ago. Um, Sometimes we refer to it in terms of simulation, although that's probably not the ideal word, because tends to that tends to bring about ideas and imagery of virtual reality as we understand it, in terms of digital, um, almost like a video game, like that sort of virtual reality. It's a close analogy in a lot of ways, but it's far from perfect. So that is the very short, very brief kind of overview.
Awesome, man. That was great. Great elevator pitch. Um, so this specific series of events occurred involving a war, and we're not specifically certain who the parties were in this war. Um, However, at the end of this war, it would seem that human beings were, or whatever we were at the time, were the spoils of war. We were property that was transferred via some sort of legal procedure to a malicious party, um, the wrong side of the conflict. And at that point, people were rounded up. They were imprisoned, and then they went through the what Morgan was referring to. Um, there was a period where a lot of people were being killed, according to the data. And from what I understand from talking to Morgan and Dan, following this series of events, um, the people who were left, not just human beings, but potentially other hominids, were done away with in some way. The slate was wiped clean. The original planet Terra, Earth, is in a pretty pristine condition according to the data at this time. And I wanted to point out to everyone that when we look at the history, because we can look at the history of the clairvoyant data and the clairvoyant movements in history. We can look at mythology, uh, and when we look at mythology and also recorded history, um, there was an event specifically recorded across cultures where we were taught that almost everyone was perished, right? And specifically in the Christian Bible, this is called the Great Flood, and we're told only 8 people survived. But the flood myth is found in more than 37 cultures, and is recorded in ancient Mesopotamian texts, tablets. It was recorded in ancient Mesoamerican texts. It was recorded as a fact in ancient Chinese texts as well. So it was recorded as history in these texts. And there's some debate now about what they were recording and to what extent it was mythological. One thing I like to point out to people when the topic of the Great Flood comes up, a lot of people don't recognize or realize this. And I'm not telling anyone that word for word the Bible isn't literally true. I'm not getting into that discussion. What I'm saying is that when you study flood visions, flood dreams, historically, going way, way back, and also in the modern times, I can give you 2 examples. Carl Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien were both plagued by visions um, of a massive flood sweeping through Europe following World War One. And throughout the 20s and 30s, they both repeatedly had these visions of this massive flood. And Jung later recognized, and I believe Tolkien did as well, but Jung specifically wrote about it, that these visions and dreams he was having of that flood were a foreshadowing. They were a prediction of World War II. And people who study dreams and visions will tell you that archetypally, I'm sorry, I'm not being very articulate today. Again, archetypally, flood imagery and warfare and disaster are interchangeable. All right. So we know that there was an event where, or history tells us there was an event where almost everyone was wiped out. So that also is a form of confirmation. Like, this isn't something that these guys invented from like reading too much sci-fi that no one has ever talked about. It's all over the place when you know what to look for. Um, and we know, from the interestingly enough, we know from the biblical timeline, right? And I'm not getting into religious arguments. What I'm saying is, according to people who studied the Old Testament, right, the flood happened around 2349 BC, and coincidentally, interestingly, another or series of other events are recorded happening at that same time. So around that same time, there was a world war between the Mesopotamian gods, the Anunnaki, recorded. That's been talked about a lot by the UFO people. Um, Recorded in ancient tablets and involving Mesopotamia, involving the Harappan civilization and civilizations in sort of what is Pakistan and Afghanistan now, um, where supposedly a lot of people were wiped out. Um, the the Chinese have a story about him, and this is going to sound like a complete like it's not related, but it is. The Chinese have a story of ancient astronauts going to the moon. That also happened at this exact period of time, and this is relevant because a lot of remote viewers, not the Intuitive Underground group, but who report this information, who talk about soul traps, uh, they talk about them being related to the moon. Again, this isn't the data that Morgan has, but this is what other people discuss. And I believe Dan um, was saying in um, our previous space that the lunar wave is real, and there's an individual there who's responsible for it. And he didn't um, discuss what that meant, but I looked into it, and the lunar wave is the idea that whatever is really up there in the moon, there is a projection on top of it that obscures whatever is really there, a hologram of some sort. And so that does seem to have shown up somewhere in the data, or at least Dan, the other remote viewer, believes it does. It did.
Yeah, I would back that up. There's something there. Yes.
Right. So the reason I mention that is that it's interesting that all of these things that come up in the data also show up in recorded history when you know where to look at around the same period of time. And I think that's notable. Um, there is one clairvoyant movement. Well, okay, let me just explain this. So the important thing about the Intuitive Underground data, Morgan and Dan's groups and their data, they did about a 10-year long, and I guess it's ongoing, so more than 10 years, but they had a good solid 10 years at one point where they were investigating the state of reality. They were looking into a lot of targets that no one else had thought to look into, or before anyone else had thought to look into them. And none of them really had a background in understanding, like, ancient cultures and ancient history and ancient religions and even ancient clairvoyant movements. So they really didn't know what people had said in the past. And when I discovered the Intuitive Underground material, I recognized that it was discussing the same topics that previous clairvoyant movements had discussed. A lot of that information from previous clairvoyant movements in history is obscured because historians don't believe in the reality of extrasensory perception. So they eliminate the data when they record the history. And when you search out like primary sources, you find it's a lot of times it's encoded. They use allegory, they use metaphors, um, they try to disguise the data they got through their form of remote viewing, their form of claircognizance. Primarily, history tells us because they were persecuted, right? There were repeat periods where these clairvoyant movements were persecuted. As we know about the Gnostic Christians, were wiped out. They were wiped out, and all of their books were burned. And the reason we have them today is that some people went off into the middle of deserts and buried copies there because they sort of saw the writing on the wall. Well, that information is almost like incomprehensible sometimes when you read it. And I read those documents years ago, years and years and years ago, and or at least translations of those documents. Let me be honest. And I could not make heads or tails of it. And I dismissed the information because it just didn't make any sense. And going forward in my my studies of history, right, I'd find these movements over and over again. And when you got into their allegorical information, like it just was bizarre. Um, when you have when you are familiar with the intuitive underground material, that changes immediately. And all of that information is crystal clear because the intuitive underground information is a Rosetta Stone. Just like we had lost the ability to read hieroglyphs until we discovered the Rosetta Stone that had hieroglyphs and then ancient Greek on top of it, and then Latin, and then French, and so they were able. Well, I don't think French was there, but it had a number of ancient languages, right? And because of that, they were able to They looked the languages they did know how to read, and they were able to use that to translate the other languages. They learned how to speak a number of ancient languages, and they learned how to read ancient hieroglyphics again. After a long period of no one, including people in Egypt, having any idea how to do that. That's what the intuitive underground material allows us to do. So that material represents like one group of viewers, and it's confirmed by the material from other remote viewers who obscure their data. But it's also confirmed by 2,500 years of claircognizant movements, thousands, probably, at least hundreds of viewers, possibly thousands of viewers, right? And some of them, like, very good. And their interpretations, right? They weren't trained as rigorously as Morgan is. They didn't have the scientific method back then. They didn't have military protocols for remote viewing. So it's likely that there's a lot of analytical overlay with some of their data. And it's also likely that there's a lot of interpretation to fit their pre-existing ideologies and ideas about the world and reality. However, the core of what they relate is still extremely consistent. Now, one of the foremost clairvoyants in human history was a man named Rudolf Steiner. He came out of the Theosophy movement, which was a movement founded by individuals who went to Tibet in the mid 1800s. Mid 1900s, actually, right? So 1850, 1860, they went to Tibet. They studied esoteric Tibetan texts, Buddhist texts, one in particular. They brought that information back to the West. They founded a movement called Theosophy. They were involved with some clairvoyants. They had some clairvoyant members, but they also had the information from that esoteric Buddhist text, which was retrieved through clairvoyance over a long period of time by the Tibetan Buddhists. Rudolf Steiner was sort of in that circle for a while, but he was, or at least in his opinion, decidedly Christian. He broke with them, and he brought his clairvoyant information forward. And he's a remarkable clairvoyant. I don't trust him completely. I don't really trust anyone. I don't trust him, or I don't trust his legacy, because I think that he did fit a lot of the data into pre-existing personal ideological his personal ideology. However, like he predicted 100 years ago, he predicted COVID. 100 years ago. one of the things that he talked about, which is relevant to this, I know I'm making a short story long, was he has these three figures, right? Two of them archons and one of them Jesus, that are part of his cosmology. And the two archons that he claims are responsible for creating this simulation, this reality overlay, which they don't like people talking about. They don't like people disclosing this information, but in theosophical terms, it's referred to as the eighth sphere, which is something very taboo. And whenever theosophists would write books about it, the other theosophists would come down on them. The eighth sphere was created, according to Steiner, by an archon named Lucifer. Now, that's Steiner's term for him. Who knows what his real name would be? And another archon named Ahriman, and Ahriman being the ancient Zoroastrian name for the devil. So Steiner says that Lucifer incarnated in China, and he lived his life as the Yellow Emperor, the mythical ancestor of the Chinese. And that was 2700 BC. So that's right in that period of time. And of course, Christ was incarnated, around year zero. And according to Steiner, there's actually an archon alive in the world today, right now, living in the United States of America. And no, it's not Trump. Nothing political. It's not a political figure. So those two individuals responsible for the eighth sphere, responsible for creating the reality overlay, apparently incarnated into it. And so that gives us sort of an idea of what the time period is. And again, that time period also matches up with what history tells us was the period where everyone but 8 people disappeared from the historical record, at least mythologically speaking. So, so we're trapped in this prison planet, right? This prison reality. And people are going to say, well, this isn't a prison reality because that's not what my belief system says. But I'm here to tell you that's what everyone's belief system says. That is the fundamental presupposition for the majority of the religions that have popped up on this planet over the last 2,500 years. And even the people who deny that we're in a prison reality, right? Religious fundamentalists are, have such a stereotypical, like small stereotype range of behaviors that are acceptable in the religion. I'm not saying they're wrong. And you have to do certain types of work. You have to think about certain things. You have to talk certain ways. You have to relate to other people in certain ways. You can't read certain books. You can't think about certain ideas. And if you step outside of these parameters at all, right, you're going to be subject to demonic obsession, demonic possession, eternal suffering. No one makes a better case for the prison reality than extremely fundamental modern Christians do. However, the religious perspective is more like people who are trying to be on their best behavior while they're in prison. We can talk all we want about like freedom, right? But anyone who has like really been exposed to a fundamentalist religious life knows that it is not freedom. It is freedom in the next world. It's not freedom in this world. So people want to know how do we get out, right? Like how do we escape this situation? Because once you accept that this is sort of like a universally acknowledged thing that no one wants to talk about, then you understand that like we're in this situation where there's a reason why people don't want to look at having to the changes they would have to make in order to get out. So when we come back to the consent-based phenomenon model, and we have people come online after we did our space and say, no, all you have to do is imagine yourself backing out and, and your spirit is back in the Orion constellation, and then you'll be free. Or a famous remote viewer who commented on on our space by saying, I can, if my mind can go anywhere, then I'm not in prison. And what we're telling you is the data says you're physically in prison. So how do we get out of this physical prison? Now, Morgan, I'm going to call you back on now to talk about the different session data and what it says about the end of life process and what it says about how to escape the trap that we're all in.
Okay, well, I'm going to be very, very surface level here because the truth of the matter is we don't have a great amount of detail on the specifics on that. Um, Part of the reason is um, after when we first kind of discovered this whole kind of concept that we're talking about here, we ran some projects that were intended um, to help us get exactly those answers. And at the time, those results actually seemed rather satisfactory, and to large extent they are. However, in this process that we've been engaged in recently, in reviewing the bulk of our work as a whole, it's actually really helped us identify where we're solid and where we're less solid. And one of the areas that we're actually less solid is, as I kind of just said, the specifics in terms of exactly how that's done. I mean, the short answer is don't fall for the false comforting light trap. That's number one. And that's really, I think that's totally primary here. Um, Now, what that data told us was that okay, that's totally valid. Don't don't go into the light. However, it also indicated that there is a secondary process that's going to occur if at such a time you choose not to do that. Um, and that process was referred to in the session data as um, was it a balancing of the ledger or a settling of accounts. Now the problem is I was the project manager on that project specifically, and in reviewing the data, it occurs to me that I didn't fully recognize at the time what that meant or the importance of it. So at this point in time, I don't have a great deal of data going really much further on that. And I should mention that the next kind of phase of our overall project here, that's going to be the primary focus. Um, so in the hopefully not too distant future, I'm going to be able to come back to you with a lot more in terms of specifics on that. But the short answer is don't fall for the trap. And I can say that if you, at such a time as you find yourself permanently left without your body, there are going to be signs, indicators, warnings to assist you in that process, but you need to be ultra aware and basically just keeping your wits about you.
Now, following that action, if one is able to maintain, because we don't know how hard it is to maintain consciousness of our own identity and our own agenda following what we can only assume is a traumatic experience. It's either traumatic or you're so pumped up on endorphins that you're probably not thinking clearly anyhow. Um, so you die, you're all pumped up on endorphins, or you're traumatized, I guess, depending on the individual. and then you're out of your body, and there's a tunnel and a light, and the light is comforting, and perhaps you see some relatives, and they say, come on, come into the light. And if you do that, if you go into the light, um, then you have an experience where there's an individual there who um, sort of fidgets around in your body, or that's the perception at least, and then puts you to sleep. But if you, and then at some point there's a soul recycler involved. If you don't go into the light, um, what happens then? Do you wind up in a sort of a false, or um, I think your term was corrupted, life review process that maybe sort of like a judgment scenario as well?
Yeah, that's correct. That's what the viewer referred to as a settling of accounts or a balancing of the ledger.
So in your work, did the concept of contracts, life contracts, or contracts related to this situation that we're in, did that come up for you?
Yeah, to some extent, yes, it was definitely referenced,
Is that
and
go ahead.
but just very clearly that it was perceived as a corrupted process. We've used the terms corrupted, hijacked, things to that effect over and over and over again.
Other viewers unrelated to your project who've looked into this situation always mention a contract as well, at least the ones that I've seen their session work, or read their session work material. Um, and it's sometimes referred to as a life contract. So the impression that I have from your work and their work is that at some point prior to this, being in this situation, that we very well may have signed some type of actual contract, not a metaphorical contract. And based on your session data that seemed to show that following being imprisoned, there was some sort of violent altercation, and then following that, people were put into this experiment, and it being an experiment. And also, I think both in your data and other remote viewers' data, there seems to be a discussion, like a moral quandary amongst the people involved in creating the experiment, about whether they should do it or not. So it's very much comes across as a very taboo and very real experiment. So just knowing what we do about life, right? It would not be out of the range of possibility for somebody to have to sign a contract before being subject to an experiment. And I think it may be speculation, not backed up in your data, or it may be backed up in your data, but I think one could speculate that the alternative to either remaining imprisoned without being in the experiment, or having the same fate as the others who mutinied against the imprisonment, which was being killed, very well could have been to sign this contract and get involved in this experiment, because that happens during wars here. That happened during World War II, both domestically, right, where we had Seventh-day Adventists and religious dissenters who didn't want to go to war were forced to sign contracts and participate in medical experiments if they didn't want to get drafted. And we also know, of course, that the Nazis and the Japanese also um, also staged, medical experiments slash war crimes, right? So like that would seem to make sense that there might be some sort of contract involved. And the reason I think that's notable is that that's something that comes through the UFO experiencer community, which is another community where you find people are a little resistant to the concept that this could be a simulation or a reality overlay. They're a little resistant to the idea that this is a prison planet. But at the same time, they will admit that their lived experience is being abducted randomly from their beds at night and taken to a ship, taken to an operating room, and being subject to medical experiments while they're awake and without anesthesia. Um, being raped, tortured for fun, um, impregnated, forced to carry children to term, and then forced to return and being abducted to interact with the children that they conceived as the result of being raped in this torture chamber slash operating room that they're randomly abducted to. So, like, reason I point out those unpleasant facts is that one could say that there's a reason psychologically why someone in that situation wouldn't want to acknowledge this is a prison reality, right? Because that's you would want to disassociate from your trauma as much as possible. And that's something that we find with remote viewers who look into this information, who later go on to disavow the idea or even argue vehemently against the idea that this is a prison reality. Oftentimes, they've been tasked with seeing, sometimes even themselves, subject to these medical experiments without anesthesia. Um, One viewer that I read his session work, I watched his videos, described himself repeatedly screaming over and over again, "I'm in hell, I'm in hell." Um, that's the type of thing uh, that people see, and it's understandable why they would want to disassociate from that, and why they would reflexively have a psychological reaction that caused them to deny this is a prison reality. But I think that we could all agree that a reasonable person might conclude from those events, should they be real, and I believe they are, but okay, let's just say, should they be real, that that would certainly indicate that this is a prison reality, at least for the individuals involved, right? Um, so now we're in this life review process, settling of accounts, which I would look at as like a judgment scenario. And what I think is interesting about that is if we go back to these where these ancient religions began, right? The ancient religions that have informed our present religious beliefs, like say in ancient Egypt, when you died, right? We all know the story that you had an ethical code, ma'at, and please, my pronunciation is probably terrible. um, you had an ethical code that you had to live by, and after your death, you were tried. Basically, your heart was ripped out of your chest and put on a scale, and a feather was put on the other side, and your heart had to be lighter than the feather, and that was symbolic for you having no you not having any like sins, I guess we could call them sins. I don't know if they would use the term sins, but like you couldn't be guilty of harming others in any number of ways, um, because if you were, you'd get recycled. We find that in Zoroastrianism, which is the religion that informed Judaism and Christianity, and also Buddhism, where the trial is while one is walking across a narrow bridge, and that bridge is actually mentioned in the New Testament, by the way. Um, and if you had any of these sins or a history of harming others in various ways, you go over the side, and I think it's into a lake of fire type scenario. But we could speculate. Um, we could speculate on the soul recycler at that point, because from what I've read, it's a very painful process. Um, and fire and lightning are terms that seem to come up. Feelings of fire and lightning. Um, I think if you look at most ancient belief systems, you have a people being judged after they pass away, and their fate, what their next life is going to be, or if they're going to go to heaven and hell, that is based on this process of judgment. And again, this precedes like a monotheism, right? So it would be a group of angels or a group of archons or a group of servants of archons that would be involved in the judgment process. And that is where we ran into the problem with that Skywatch UFO um, account handle. I'm sure they're a perfectly wonderful person. I have no criticism of them. This is not airing any grievances. But they got into the whole thing, and they said, when you When you wind up in this selling of accounts, you just tell them, I don't consent, and then you're going to be free, basically, is what they said. And that is not at all what we're talking about. So Morgan has data that says it's a corrupted process. But I asked him to go back over the data and make sure, and see if there is any data specifically that says that at that point, when you're in that soul life review, balancing of accounts, that you could argue or should argue that the process was corrupt, or that you were forced to sign a contract under duress and therefore it's not valid. And as of last night, when I talked to Morgan, that information was not in the session work. It may have been implied in some places, but it definitely is not there definitively. Is that true, Morgan?
Yeah, that would be fair to say. I mean, put it this way. We are our group. We have fairly high standards in what we would consider cross-referenced and cross-validated data, and what we're talking about here, you're right, it does not meet that bar yet.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. And you know what? If that data comes across, if you get that data, if it comes across your desk, metaphorically speaking, and we'll do a space, right? And we'll contact Doomer and Fringe, and we'll say, hey, we gotta get this information out because I was wrong. And in fact, all you got to do is tell them to go F themselves, and then you're free, and it's the whole thing is over. But that's not what the data seems to. But that's not what the data seems to say, and it's also not what any of the ancient clairvoyant movements indicated, or the religions they spawned. Right. So it's definitely not what the ancient Egyptians would say, or it's definitely not what the Hindus would say. It's not anything that the Zoroastrians would have said. It's not something that the Gnostics necessarily believed, although I'll get into that in a second. This settling of accounts seems to indicate, I mean, I don't think the word karma, was the word karma used specifically, Morgan?
No.
Okay. So it seems to relate to karma, but the word wasn't used specifically. But it seems to be that either you need to answer for your acts to them, or you need to answer for your behavior in your life to each other, either through the mechanism of karma or through the mechanism of some judgment. And other remote viewers, aside from Morgan's team, have talked about people being cajoled, first having their memories wiped and then being cajoled and told, like, this happened and this happened, and you owe these people, or you haven't perfected yourself really that well, so you should probably go back and have this experience so you can learn to be less harmful, so you can learn to be less angry. So that seems to be a theme that comes up both in the myth, the religion, religious information, the mythological information, and the ancient clairvoyant information, and the session work of various remote viewers. I do know it also seems to come up in remote, not through Morgan's group. It also seems to come up through remote viewing of the UFO phenomenon. Specifically, I can think of one example where John Vivananko, I'm sure I'm messing up his name, John Vivananko, who's a great guy, by the way. They do a podcast / TV show called Metaphysical, which is really, if you like remote viewing entertainment, it's way, way beyond Farsight Prime or future forecasting. And most of them are available for free on YouTube, full shows. I'm not saying they always hit the target. Morgan would be the one who would make those judgments. I can't make those judgments, but they always hit the target of being entertaining. When they looked into the black box that is often seen in UFO abduction scenarios and is often tied to the planet Saturn in interactions with non-human intelligence, they saw it as having something to do with holding karma and the records of a person's life. So it's actually, it may not come up in every person's, every experiencer slash abductee's experience, but it does come up in the UFO abduction experience, that they have devices that they're recording both the details of your life and your karma, so that, you know, then you have to balance it later. And so I think that's an important point, because regardless of whether this is a corrupted procedure, right, or not, it seems that what Morgan's data says, and what everyone else's data seems to indicate, is that you're going to be put on trial for the events of your life. And if you don't pass that trial, now whether that's by making some sort of argument that they don't have jurisdiction over you, or by actually having lived a life where you weren't very harmful, they're going to throw you in the recycler. So when people ask, well, how do we get out of this? There may be a way to get out of it by making arguments about the validity of the whole process, but we don't know that. And that seems to be an assumption people jump to. And most people who are listening to this, or who, you know, are not going to remember it, but God forbid somebody should pass away, get to that point, and then start making arguments, you know, start blowing a rape whistle and yelling about consent. You know, I do not consent. And then they're back in the recycler, because that's not how it works. Because this isn't, you know, modern liberal America in 2025 and the Me Too movement, which is, I'm sure, a very important movement, right? And everyone should honor and respect everything about consent. I'm not making that argument. I'm saying that after we die, you know, taking that metaphor and using it, trying to adapt it to getting out of eternal judgment, or being stuck in a matrix slash reality overlay, that's not a sound thing to tell people to do. And it could be you know, like that account, right, with 25,000 followers. God forbid that people should actually act on that advice and get recycled, because that's on them. And you know who's absolutely going to get recycled at that point? Skywatch. Okay, and whoever advocated for it. Our conception of what harmful behavior is, and the traditional conception, are like very far apart. Our society has adapted and developed over the course of hundreds of years to justify and rationalize behavior that people throughout human history recognized as being wrong. And that was prior to us becoming a secular society. And we wouldn't have become a secular society, in my opinion, if we hadn't first begun to justify and rationalize harmful behavior towards others as being acceptable, depending on what we believed, or I don't know, what our economic system, right, or our political beliefs. So what do the ancient people say? Like, what do the ancients say about that life review process? And I'm going to tell you specifically what I know the people at the time that Christianity started. I can tell you what the ancient Greek people, and, you know, the Hermeticists and the Astrotheists, and the Gnostic Christians who evolved out of that milieu, I can tell you what they said. And what they said is, you know, the planets are the gods, right? I'm sure everyone gets that. The planets were tied into the gods. So each planet had a god, and that god is the archon, or ruler of that principality. This is mentioned in the New Testament. And so it's like a big bad and a bunch of angels or demons, or whatever you want to call them, right? Because at that time, angel was not what it is today. That word angel didn't mean a good guy who was there to help us, right? It was generally a bad thing if you were to run into an angel. The word demon and devil has gained in popularity as time goes on, but I don't want anyone to make any mistake. We're talking about the same people. All right? We're talking about the same people. You want to talk about demons? There are definitely incorporeal things people experience and call demons, but you want to talk about, you know, devils and I don't know, whatever name you want to ascribe to them, because that's the name I'm more comfortable with. That's what the archons and the asuras who serve them are, right? um, it's just a different name. So you had the planets, particularly 7 planets. I think the Gnostic said there were 13 worlds, 13 universes, but specific to what we're talking about in the ancient world, when someone died, their goal was to return to the stars, to the fixed stars, the constellations. Um, Spiritually, your spirit, that's where you wanted your spirit to go. But in order to do that, you had to get through the archons who were trapping you here. Um, Remember, the ancient Greeks did not think this was the real world. Okay, they did not. They said this is not the real world. This world is an illusion. The real world is on the other side of the black sun. Now, what the black sun is, that's sort of lost to history and up to debate. People have different theories on that. All right, but it's not like we look back and say, "Oh, the Greeks were rational and the Romans they didn't have these beliefs." No, they definitely did have these beliefs. Ancient people believed this world was an illusion. They did. Um, Maybe not the ancient Jewish people. I can't speak for, I don't, but the majority of ancient cultures they did. So your soul would be free, and you would begin an ascension up through the system to the planets, and you'd go first to the moon, and then to Mercury, and then to the sun. Then you go to Venus, and then you go to Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. And I know I'm belaboring this point by naming each one of them. And at each planet, you would be greeted by an archon, and that archon um, would demand that you justify being able to leave and not be chained to that planet anymore by the force that the planet exerts, which is where astrology came from. But so those forces, that's a hold on my phone. Okay, those forces, that's a metaphor, right? The planets don't exert forces. That's patterns of behavior in human beings that we can't see directly, we can't perceive directly. So transpersonal patterns in human behavior that are only visible when we use an outside object in order to keep track of those patterns. And so what astrology is an analog um, simulation model, just like computers have digital simulation models like the Sims. Well, that's what astrology is, an analog simulation model. Um, However, the archons altered our nature and placed new behaviors in us, a sinful nature. It's also something that the fallen angels were accused of doing prior to the flood, just to get that on the record. Because it's the same, we're talking about the same people or things, whatever the hell they are, right? Uh, so there were 7 particular character traits that the archons had put into us. The Hermeticists said they did it because they loved us and they wanted us to stay with them and be like them. And of course, that's not what the data shows. And it's also not what the largest clear cognizant movement in human history, the Christian Gnostic movement, said. Um, Although I think they're probably rivaled by remote viewers now as far as size is concerned. So they did it because they hated us and they wanted to feed on us and they wanted to create horrible despair and negative emotions because in some way that horrible despair, that pain and suffering that we experience is something they feed on. And Morgan talks about us being used as a battery. I don't know how it interacts one with the other, right? Robert Monroe talked about Loosh coming from that emotional suffering. There is some sort of interaction. I think Morgan should look closer into it at some point. But it is clear that they altered us to control us emotionally. And also because they feed off of that suffering in some way. The sources are pretty unanimous about that. So you go to the sun, right? And you have to relinquish the arrogance of the ruler. And there's an area in each of our lives where we're extremely arrogant. We're naturally in the spotlight in that area, and we don't treat other people very well. Right? That is a trait that we each have that causes harm and suffering to other people. And it may be, we're so desensitized to the harm and suffering we cause to others now that it may not be like something you would think about. We think now if we don't beat someone senseless or murder them, then we're not accountable for that behavior. And some people would argue we're not accountable for beating people senseless. And some people would argue we're not accountable for murdering people, right? That's the point we're at in this society. However, um, the people who had these visions, they were pretty unanimous on the fact that we're accountable for creating suffering for others on all levels. And so, arrogance is one of the seven deadly sins, right? So what happened is the planets were referred to as aerial toll houses, and that became part of early Christianity, and it became part of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church still has, to this day, the teaching about aerial toll houses. They don't emphasize it, they don't talk about it much, but it has never been abandoned officially. It has never been ruled heretical or false. That's still part of the Orthodox faith. In Catholicism, they took the aerial toll houses and the meeting the archon and having to justify that you're having to release that character trait and say, I'm not, I don't have that trait in me anymore. Let me through, basically. They took that and they got rid of all the language they didn't like, and they created the seven deadly sins. And they altered them in certain ways. And I'll give you the prime example. So Jupiter, the aerial toll house that you would go to after your death, um, it symbolizes, or the force, the flaw, um, was the evil impulses that result from wealth. Now, as people may know, one of the things that happened um, in the ancient world is they didn't really like that idea that wealth was wrong, so they kind of got rid of all that language, or they downplayed it, right? So instead of the evil impulses that result from wealth, the the deadly sin that we have today is gluttony. Well, gluttony is certainly an evil impulse that results from wealth, but it's one out of, right, one out of what, 800 or 1,000, something like that, right? I don't think it's a list. I'm just saying, like, hypothetically. Um, so they altered that language, but the fact that those survive to this day is part of the teachings of the Catholic Church, part of the teachings of the Orthodox Church, show you how universal they were at the time of the beginning of the Christian Church, and or the Catholic Church, whatever. Um, and they were universal in paganism at that time as well, right? So the idea was you had to ascend from planet to planet, and you had to, officially prove to them that you had released or overcome these specific character traits. Now, coincidentally, these are the same type of character traits that would create karma for you in Eastern systems, where Buddhism and Hinduism, Jainism would say that the way that you escaped reincarnation in this world, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about being reincarnated here, the experience of being reincarnated, although we're alive. That's what we believe. We're alive in a physical location. We're having these repeated dreams, right? And these dreams are these other reincarnations. And the Eastern religions that were founded at the same time during the axial age, following the triple conjunction of Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. That's the astrology of it, right? They teach us that in order to achieve nothingness, in order to get out of this situation, right, we have to abandon these very same traits and behaviors. So if someone is asking the question, well, how do we get out of this? Well, the answer could be, argue and tell them that they don't have any jurisdiction over you, and maybe they'll let you go. But maybe the data doesn't say that, but Morgan could come back in 6 months and say, "Hey, good news. All you got to do is fight it." I don't think that's going to be the case, because that's not anyone else's data, historically speaking, right? The answer there is you have to work in your life to get rid of these traits that they programmed into us to cause harm and suffering to others. And it makes sense, all right? It makes sense because you're in a reality overlay. You're in a, I mean, we don't like to use the word term simulation, but you can say simulation. Again, like Morgan says, it conjures up the idea we're in a computer mainframe, and that's not true. You're in this false reality, okay? And you're supporting it, right? Like it's in our minds. So the suffering that people are experiencing is suffering we're causing. All right. So if somebody kidnaps you and kidnaps someone else and puts you in a room like Saw, right? The movie, those movies, and says, okay, you can live if you torture that person. Are you guilty of committing a crime? Yes. Yes, you are. And people say, well, no, because it's under duress. Well, that's the deranged modern perspective. So the suffering that we cause each other is what they feed off of, and it is what maintains the false reality. And therefore, being a willing participant in causing that suffering to others is being an accomplice. And when, or a collaborator, and when you get to that point where you're doing some sort of life review, they're going to say, where are you going? You've been torturing the shit out of everyone. Okay. And I mean, basically, I'm putting this in my modern, Boston vernacular, right? But that's what they're going to say. You owe it to these people because you have been doing this. It's not us. We put you in there. We're not forcing you to do it. We're not forcing you to torture people. Prove that you're worthy. And that's the lie, right? The lie is that they're going to tell you is, you're in there to prove that you're worthy. You're in there on probation to prove that you're worthy of being allowed out. They're not going to tell you that you're dead in a tube. They're not going to tell you that, right? Like right at the edge of death. They're going to say, no, once you prove that you're worthy, we're going to let you out. This is a test. This is a school. Go back to class and try to be better. Now, you're compelled to do these things to cause this harm to other people because they fucked with you and put that into your nature, right? You're fallen now and sinful by nature, and you harm others. And that's the injustice that Morgan is referring to, or one of the injustices that Morgan is referring to, right? It doesn't matter though. You still can't do it. You can't do it. And Morgan, I'm gonna let you in here in a second because I know that I'm on a roll here. Let me tell you, like, I work with these viewers. I talk to these viewers, not just Morgan's group, other viewers who have. Hey, Morgan, can you take it for a second?
Yeah. And I'm gonna jump back a sec to something JT talked about earlier, regarding the cognitive dissonance that some people, in my case, viewers, experience when we're looking into this sort of thing, and it's very real. And I myself probably didn't actually recognize the ultimate source of that until JT himself pointed it out to me. And JT referred to it in terms of not maybe just cognitive dissonance in terms of how we would normally think of these kind of things, but actually as a form of PTSD, almost as though coming across this kind of information triggers some sort of, perhaps you could think of it as genetic memory, and that is that coming across this kind of thing rings so true that frankly it's disturbing. It's disturbing to think about. And I mean, let me be clear, I don't enjoy um, talking about or even thinking about this sort of thing. It's bothersome is probably too mild a word, honestly. And that's probably why we got to a certain point in this project, and we kind of left it abandoned for a period of time, because it was probably almost, frankly, too much to handle. Um, it it's disturbing. It's shocking. It makes me angry, but it also kind of makes me depressed. Now, I'll also recognize the fact that that's probably by design to some extent. And so in this process that we've been going through, over the last, I don't know, 6+ months, in reviewing all of this data and kind of connecting the dots, trying to see the bigger picture, and, well, connect dots when they're there, and also recognizing when and where there are no connections. Um, it has, in some sense, kind of actually taken a toll on me. I mean, I'll be honest. maybe a mild way of putting it is I almost feel a little burnt out in having to think about this sort of thing. But as awful and I guess I'll use the word negative as a lot of this stuff is, the ultimate purpose. I do want to be clear. It's not to bask in the horror of it. In the same sense as one might choose to watch a horror movie to purposely induce fear and disgust, um, as a form of entertainment. It's really not that at all. I mean, our ultimate goal here is in finding practical solutions. So I just want to highlight that a little bit. That again, and for the people who weren't here at the very beginning, just again to be clear, the stuff that we're talking about here is well, it's not even my own words. A lot of people have said that this is the darkest, doomiest, gloomiest concept that they've ever heard. And yeah, I tend to agree. It's straight up, it's beyond the scope of my own capacity for imagination here. Um, and I think that's why, I personally, even though I'm directly involved in this project as a viewer and in some cases as a remote viewing project manager, and it's tough. It's tough for me. So I just really want to be clear that I understand and not just sympathize but empathize with anyone that may be feeling certain things about this, the nature of this discussion. Believe me, I'm right there with you. And the only reason that I'm actually continuing on with this mission is out of what I feels like a sense of duty or necessity. Um, if I could if I could offload this work to someone else or another group of viewers, I'd happily do so, but I think that would be irresponsible. So I'm kind of compelled. I wouldn't go so far as to say forced, but I do feel compelled to continue with this line of inquiry. Again, as I said, in search ultimately of positive solutions. So I really want to reiterate to everyone that that is the ultimate goal here is to find positive and practical solutions to this predicament that we find ourselves in. And again, understanding, there's going to be a certain percentage, probably a very large percentage of the general population that would never even consider entertaining this as possibility, let alone probability, let alone concrete fact. And that's fine. I believe me, I understand, and in large part, I'm right there with you. Unfortunately, yeah, I simply do believe that the stuff that we're talking about here is the case, and the first step in finding real world solutions to real world problems is acknowledging that we have a problem here. Um, and when GT gets back, I'm actually gonna.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take a couple of screenshots of some of our session data that kind of illustrates some of the ideas that we're talking about here. Something you talked about a short time ago, with the idea of the ultimate goal being to dissipate back into the universe. I actually have that very, very clearly depicted in some of my own session work. And I'm gonna it'll take me a minute to dig it out, but I'm going to I'll have to take a screenshot because for whatever reason X doesn't play well with PDFs, and all of our stuff is in PDF format. But I'm gonna show you some of the raw session work that actually depicts very clearly and very specifically exactly that concept. And I will say, in my own session work that shows that, there is actually no indication whatsoever of this life review process, but it does show up in some of the other work. So it's possible that that's not a strictly a universal experience, and that's one of the areas where we're just not clear enough to say exactly one way or another.
Okay, fairly. Okay, I get what you're saying, right? But it does show up in all of the ancient religions, ancient clairvoyant community data, and it also shows up in other remote viewers. So the balance of the of judgment here would be to assume that it is. I know that you didn't see it, and it may not be universal. But if the question is how do we stop from being recycled again, then the answer has to include the most likely sort of universal scenarios, right? And I get, like, no one wants that to be real. I mean, no one wants to be judged and held accountable for things that they don't consider to be their responsibility. But that therein lies the problem. And this is not a modern problem. This is a historical problem. This goes back to the very beginning when people started talking about this 2,500 years ago, right? People don't want to be held responsible for their actions in a false reality, especially if they've been tampered with to act inhumanely to other human beings. However, it does seem to be what the deal is. All right. So the people who come forward and say, we should, rebel, young souls. Not Morgan's not one of them, but I'm thinking of Doomer's guy, Jason Giorgiani, right? Who's a very young soul. And he's, rebel, forever, war and crime forever. And I mean, just feeding the archons. That's all that is, feeding the archons, right? So here's the first one. I got remote viewers who come to me and say, we're talking about this data. Both one of my friends and remote viewers who aren't associated with Morgan's group, and they say, and people aren't remote viewers, and they say, hey, do you think we can control the simulation? How do we do that? And you got the manifestation thing going on, right? Which is, I mean, what they used to call that is black magic, right? But we'll just put that aside so there's no judgment. You're in a scenario where you're being held as a political prisoner, and you're being exposed to an experiment, and part of that experiment is harming other people and maintaining this false reality that causes immense suffering amongst other people. And if your response to that is to want to manifest a more comfortable and luxurious life, right? You're making, I mean, hypothetically, right? Let's just say that's something you're interested in. You're talking about making a bargain. You're talking about bargaining with the people imprisoning you for better personal circumstances, which is, there's a word for that, and it's called capo. It's called being a capo, right? And it comes from World War II and the concentration camps. Right? But we all understand the concept of being that one guy or person who wants to, who wants to kiss up to the jailers while, turning a blind eye to the suffering of fellow people. And callous indifference to the suffering of others is the very bottom, right? That's the first step. Okay. And look, you don't have to take my word for it, right? It's in compassion is in Buddhism, it's compassion, right? And in Christianity, it's love. You have to love your neighbor as you love yourself. You cannot be callously indifferent to another human being and claim that you love them or that you have compassion for them. It's not possible. Okay. So if you want to manifest, right, if you find out you're stuck in a horrible, torturous medical experiment, and then you say, well, my goal is to manifest a nice boat, and you say, we're going to fight this and get out of this thing, you're not getting out of anything. You're not getting out of anything. Now, just imagine you go to this life review process, which may not be universal, because Morgan didn't see it personally, okay, but everyone else did. So let's go. You go to this life review process, and you say, look, this isn't fair. I'm here under duress. You guys got to let me out. And they say, really? Under duress, huh? You're not getting anything out of this because, like, didn't you manifest that boat? How about that nice house? You got that job. You manifested that job too, right? And oh, you got that girl you really wanted, right? She didn't want anything to do with you, but you manifested that, didn't you? Right? So you're not getting anything. This isn't a rewarding situation for you. You're not invested in this. You're not part of this, a willing participant. Well, you are, right? And that doesn't mean work hard. work hard, buy the things you want, right? I'm not telling you not to do that. I mean, you shouldn't be materialistic, but whatever. Work hard, buy a latte if you want lattes, right? I buy lattes. I spend way too much money on lattes. Go on trips, go on vacations if that's what you really want. I'm not your judge. I'm not your judge. Trying to develop some sort of power or leverage over supernatural forces and non-human intelligences in order to manifest better conditions for yourself in this scenario, that's that's no good, man. That makes you a willing participant. So right off the bat, you're a willing participant. I don't know how you could possibly get out of a life review process at that point if you walk in and you do that. So I would say stop, and I tell the viewers that, and they're human beings too, right? So I get the same reception. Like I get a blank expressions, or conversations end online, and right, because the one thing they know is, hey, they might be stuck in hell, but they're going to get a nice boat. All right. I mean, the thing is,
Hey,
yeah, go ahead.
hey, JT,
Oh,
I didn't,
Zoomer,
what's up?
he put you on.
Hey,
Okay, see, I had no idea you were even speaking or on. All right, go
yeah,
ahead, dude.
I slipped through the
I
veil.
know,
I
I
had
know.
this whole
You're
life
you're
review.
you're imposing order on me in
Yeah,
yeah, in my
yeah,
in
no,
my
Well, I
escaping
was
talking
the
to
darkness.
some
judge.
1980s
I provided the
receptionist.
life review and I let him through.
That's okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Doomer. Let's do it.
well, and in fact, all I said was "fuck you," and they let me up. But
Or was that?
no, I
I'm a
just
bit of a
wanted
pushover.
I just wanted to make sure Morgan knew how to push stuff to the nest. I don't want you threading it in the. You can thread it in the comments, but it's going to be much easier for you if you just push it up to the nest up top.
Morgan does put stuff up in the nest. Morgan, you know how to put stuff up in the nest, right? I'm the one who doesn't
Um,
know the nest. I don't know where the nest is. I know I see it, but I don't know how to get there.
yeah, I think I do.
Oh man, I
it'll take
know
We're
me a
you've
not.
put
second.
things in the nest before.
Oh no, I have, but
Yeah.
I only know how to like put it in the comments
Hey,
and
Doomer,
put it.
can you put things in the nest, Doomer?
Yeah, but I can't. I can't right now. I'm staring literally at like 4 different charts, but I can
Oh God,
definitely tell you how
you're
to
on the
put stuff.
charts. You're on the
In,
charts. Yep. All
yeah,
right.
I'm balls deep
Yeah.
in the simulation, but but it's not difficult. The share button. Have you ever DM'd a post to somebody, Morgan?
Oh yeah, yeah. I know how to get stuff into the nest, but only when it's posted to the replies first.
Yeah, yeah. So, but forget the replies, forget the nest. Have you ever had any random post? Have you ever DM'd it to somebody? Have you ever like direct messaged from the post itself?
Oh yes.
So you just need to make sure that you're using the device where you're seeing the spaces player. So you're not going to be able to push stuff to the nest from a different device, right? But if you're the same screen you're looking at where you're staring at everybody's beautiful faces, if you're looking at that same device, you can pick any post on X and you hit the share button. That's the arrow pointing up right next to the bookmark in the bottom right. You hit that, and then the simulation will produce a new option at the very top. It'll say share to space, and that microphone button that says share to space, that will push it to the nest. Um, let me know if I've lost you, because I don't want you to get recycled.
Thank you, man. I appreciate you looking out for me, and I really don't want that either.
Yeah, that's the only reason I'm here.
Oh, okay. Well, no, man, I appreciate that. I think I know how to do that. I'm making the screenshots on my computer, and I'm talking on my phone, so I'm gonna.
That's okay.
It's gonna take me
Yeah,
a minute,
so
but
it's no big deal. Make all the screenshots on your computer. What I would suggest is, since you're on your computer, make the post on your computer. If you want it easy, I would just do one picture per post. Make the post, thread it, and you're thinking in your head that you need to stay within the little spaces player simulation. You have a little bit of freedom here on X. You can go outside the spaces window. You can like collapse it or roll it down, and you can go anywhere. Just can't go anywhere else on the internet. And any post, anybody else's, your own. When you hit the share button, you'll see a new option that says share to space. So you can make your post from your computer and everything. You just can't push it to the nest from your computer. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, I follow. I gotcha.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to make sure that you're not struggling, and maybe I overcorrected. But I love what you guys are doing. Keep on doing what you're doing. I think it's really important to have like a relaxed, just talk about and digest everything. So yeah, happy to be here, and I'm gonna lower myself back down to the underworld.
Okay. Oh yeah, no, thanks so much, Junior. Very much appreciate it, and appreciate you being here, man.
Yeah, and you guys had a huge impact on people. I think the way you guys talk about the stuff, I think it's really helpful that you're really candid about this is what the data says, this is sort of what I think. And I think a lot of people like JT that you kind of played bad dirty cop. You pushed the doom a little harder. I definitely enjoyed that with maybe a little too much. Maybe I'm gonna have to answer for my life review, enjoying too much how much you made Morgan and Dan Doom harder. But I personally would like I would like to understand JT, when you're talking about stuff like the life review and accountability and stuff, it would help like how to break out of this, right? It would help if you just added more texture to what is coming from the data as to how to break out and what is coming based on your own reasoning. Because personally, for me as a listener, sometimes I can't distinguish the two. That's just my personal wish, right? But I
Absolutely.
think yeah,
Absolutely.
but I think the way you guys are engaging with the subject, especially considering the emotional, radioactiveness of it, is way better than I would do because I just hit people in the face with a sledgehammer of doom.
No, no,
And I don't think it's as effective
I'm on a
as what you
rant.
guys do.
There's no question I'm on a rant.
No,
You're being very nice.
I know you are, but
Look,
the
you're a
way
good
you're
guy,
doing
dude. You're
it,
a good guy, and Fringe is a good peep as well, and we really appreciate you guys. Um, this is about just clearing the record for us. And as you can tell, like
no, I
Morgan is
think I
still
think
more
it's good.
ambivalent than I am, right? But at the end of this, we'll have at least put the record straight personally, so that in 5 years, people can't say, well, you said to march in front of the archon and tell him you don't consent, and then you won't get recycled, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, after this, I don't intend to go on rants about that. I intend to rant in every space, but not about this.
no, but I think it's good. I'm saying the way you guys are, easing into the doom, it's like I feel like I'm in the lazy boy of doom, but it's still like intense. You know what I mean? Like you guys are engaging with the subject just from the emotional timbre of it all. Like I'm happy to be in this space listening. I really just came here. I wanted to make sure Morgan's not struggling with the nest. And thanks for doing a follow-up space.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you, man, and thank you guys, you and Fringe, for for having us on there last week in the first place. It was a treat. It really was. I really enjoyed it, and to your other point, I think it's perfectly reasonable to approach these things from with from different ways, different approaches. I think because let's face it, some people need that sledgehammer to the face. Some people don't respond as well to that, and need to be eased into it. And so I think kind of a multifaceted, kind of multi-spectrum discussion, or multiple discussions on the topic, is probably
No, I
necessary.
totally agree. I totally agree, man. And that's what I'm saying. I'm saying like the way you guys are doing this, it's relaxed. And one of the things I noticed early on, which was very paradoxical when Fringe and I first started doing Doom Spaces, was the darker the subject, the less drama in the room. Like nobody comes up when you're talking about soul recycling and starts bitching about some stupid shit. They might wait till after the space. Somebody else might be blowing up your DMs. But the space itself, if the subject matter is important enough, if it's dark enough, if it requires enough courage, I mean, nobody is going to clutch. It's kind of like the barrier to entry, the level of courage it takes just to face the truth weeds out a lot of the archons for the space. So it makes sense to be relaxed the heavier the topic is, you know. So yeah, you
Okay.
guys are doing great.
So
Well, thank you, man.
let me.
And
Okay, go ahead.
I got to say, just kind of along those lines, I have definitely noticed that these kinds of spaces, there's been a distinct lack of the weird and dare I say, pointless drama that I've seen running rampant on specifically a lot of the UFO topic spaces, which I want nothing to do with. It serves no real purpose. I see it as like, high school level fighting, bickering, and it's completely unnecessary. So, I want to continue on that path of avoiding that kind of stuff at,
Right.
well, I
You
won't say at all
you
costs.
you just need to talk about what matters. That's all. Like if you talk about what matters, and sure, sometimes like when I do the intro, I'll fan up some drama because I want people to lose their shit and share the space a little bit more. But that's for the first 5 minutes, right? I'm gonna loosh farm for benevolent reasons in the first 5 minutes, but genuinely, that's there's some sort of power we have in if this whole thing at some level, right, is multiple levels of a deception operation. And so if there must be some power in suppressing the truth, there must be some power in the deception. And people don't think about the flip side. People don't think about, the positive side of ontological shock. The positive side of ontological shock is not that a bunch of people hate you and call you a fearmonger. It's having a space where you're daring to let other people in, to let their ideas be challenged, right? Like you're risking offending a bunch of people. That's vulnerability on your part, and it's vulnerability on other people's parts, right? I'm not a Christian, but my mind is always blown, and my biases are always shattered when I find out how many people have really strongly held beliefs and they're still willing to let their beliefs metal be tested. So there's already a trusting relationship there, right? That's already something special. So you don't really have to do anything special if the topics you're willing to talk about matter a lot. If the topics you're talking about don't matter a lot, yeah, of course you need a bunch of fucking drama, right? But the deeper and darker the doom, like the more enjoyable the space, because only a certain type of person is going to last there. Does that make sense? Like it's kind of a cheat code. Um, so yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse here.
It does. So let me clarify for you. I did we sort of rambled on to this space in mid conversation. So I'm not certain what everyone heard and what everyone didn't hear. So just to clarify, um, the intuitive underground work is a Rosetta Stone that allows us access to the data from past clairvoyant movements that was transmitted in allegorical form to avoid persecution and to avoid the material being lost. There have been repeated clairvoyant movements that have sprung up pretty much consistently for about 2,500 years. We can speculate. Uh, in some cases, it's not speculation, but we can certainly say it's speculation in other cases that the root of the ethical religions and a lot of other ancient religions, theological religions, henotheism, like the Roman pagan religion, and the Greek philosophies were always religious. A lot of people don't recognize that, but that's something that you learn when you study the subject closely. Um, they were originally based on clairvoyant information as well. Okay, but that's just speculation. But we definitely can say we accessed the clairvoyant information going back about 2,500 years now, by using the intuitive underground material as a Rosetta Stone. So the data that we're using, first it comes from Morgan and Intuitive Underground, and that's the data that we went over in our Doomer space. That's Morgan's specialty. We also, in a space like this, having moved forward from just getting that information on record, we use historical data from ancient history, Mesopotamian history, um, Indian history, Mesoamerican history. Hopefully next week we'll be talking to someone about that. Um, we use data from UFO contactees, and affiliated communities. We would use data from esoteric Christianity and esoteric Buddhism as related, say, by theosophy and anthroposophy. There are multiple streams of data involved. So specifically, and I'm pretty good about this because I agree with you, words do matter, right? And so I very specifically try to say, like, speculate. We can speculate if we're speculating. And if we're not, if I'm not saying that we're speculating, then what I'm doing is relating some point of data. That
Oh, I agree. You are good at that, man. No,
no,
I
no,
meant very
I'm just
specifically,
letting,
you know.
just to clarify, right? Like, it is a data point. It's not based on my own reasoning. Where I'm bringing this, like, what is different about what I'm doing is that I'm using my natural vernacular, because if I talk for more than a few minutes, I revert to my Boston Street vernacular, right? So it's paraphrasing the data, you know, in my own way. But they are data points themselves, as opposed to something that I'm pulling out of my, you know, yeah, it's all data
Yeah,
points.
and
So, and
just
yeah,
just so you know what what I was saying. I'm not saying like, oh, it seems like you're spitballing or this is your own projection. I'm saying, as a listener, I agree. Like, you're very clear and you're very calm about, like, this is what the data says. But then when it comes to, as a specific example,
yeah,
like because I'll tell you, let me just tell you what's going on in my
hmm,
head. I'm thinking, all right, so there's these archonic fucks who are reviewing my life and they're the assholes. So, you know, the real question is here, w- w- yes, that I'm accountable for my life and the shitty things I do, but these things are worse. And as a listener, I'm thinking, like, what is, first of all, the overarching question is there a distinction between the machine or the being or the thing that is creating the simulation for the entire universe, and the beings that have sort of tricked, conquered, and trapped humanity? So an open ambient question is like, are these the same beings? Right? Is God an asshole, or is it the archons? That's one overarching question. And the second one is, you know, why go through the whole rigmarole of um, convincing people to either legitimately or illegitimately or both internalize shame and accountability? This distinction, personally, it matters a lot to me, because I think a lot of people are also thinking, well, I want to be a good person, I want to be accountable, but it doesn't seem like these beings are accountable. So what's going on here, that the less accountable beings are so invested in a psychological op to make me feel shame? And then I hear JT rightfully saying, like, there's some things that obviously it's not virtuous if you're just trying to manifest your way out of it. So personally, I'm saying, like, I have a longing for more disambiguation. I have a longing for more discrimination of, like, what views are coming from the data, what views are coming from your interpretation of the data, rather than a paraphrasing, because that's morally and ontologically what I'm personally wrestling with as a listener. Does that make sense?
no, I understand what you're saying, and I did before. I'm just, you know,
My bad,
no,
man.
we communicate in different ways, right? And that's okay. Um, because we're both operating in good faith, and I know that. Um, the issue is, um, the issue is, it's okay. So we we are looking in Morgan's data. We know that there's a balancing of accounts, and it's an inference that the balancing of accounts would refer to the idea of karma. We find that in the NHI phenomenon, where individuals who have abduction experiences do report being told that their karma is being tracked. And as I pointed out, apparently in a black box that they carry around, according to um, some sources. I don't, you know, I, I think you probably missed the very beginning. I have a diabetic cat, recently diabetic, and controlling the blood sugar is like a 24-hour thing. So I don't sleep very much anymore. I'm constantly up checking the blood sugar and trying to raise the blood sugar and trying to lower the blood sugar, and injections and syringes full of honey. And it's been particularly rough the last couple of days. Particularly, this is how it always is. If you have something you need to do and it's important, then that's when the greatest obstacles will come up. So I would have, had I my druthers, I would have prepared citations. And I felt strongly about that, having the citations where I could show the actual, and maybe figuring out how to put them in the nest, or compiling them into a document to disseminate to listeners if they wanted it. Unfortunately, that hasn't been possible. I've been just caught up in this diabetic cat struggle. And I had about an hour to prepare today. So what I'm doing right now is running off of like a jot list that I have in my show prep composition book. So it's definitely true that I'm not hitting the citations.
And personally for me, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like, you come across as very prepared, just
Okay,
to be
cool.
clear. Like, don't let
Yeah.
the diabetes thing like kill you.
But the collaboration is the issue. It is specifically the issue with the corrupted situation. That is the claim that they have in the corrupted situation, is consent, supposedly, to participate. And that comes up in Morgan's work as contracts. It comes up in other remote viewers' work as having signed life contracts to be part of this experiment. So that's sort of the crux of like the getting out of it, is demonstrating that one is a non-participant, that one is not cooperating. So the power that we have specifically to get out of this is more Gandhi and less General Sherman. It's non-cooperation, and specifically what they want our cooperation with is maintaining the reality overlay and inflicting suffering on each other. The imprisonment aspect, that is a res ipsa locutor situation, right? The thing itself speaks. Imprisonment is universal to the human experience, right? Kids are born and we imprison them in daycare, and then we imprison them in school, then we stick them in a job, and if they're not good at their job, or if they don't show up, then they're homeless, and that's a crime. And if they piss against a tree, because they're homeless, then they can be put on a sex offender list. And then if they got mental illness, if they think differently, we either going to imprison them for having the mental illness, or compel them to take medication. And when you get old, then we're imprison you in a nursing home. And if you violate ever-growing criminal codes, then we're going to imprison you in a jail cell. And we imprison our animals, both our pets, where we now tend not to allow them out of the house. We imprison them, and we have crates that we put them in. And of course, the one thing no one wants to ever talk about is what we do to the animals we eat, where we imprison them in the most horrific way imaginable, doing the very things that are done to us by the Archons to billions and billions of animals every year. And some people will make decisions based on morality, or their sense of morality and ethics. And other people say, ultimately it doesn't matter because the suffering is going to happen to the animal anyhow. But that's just a res ipsa locutor situation. I don't think that Morgan has ever looked into that specifically.
Do you mind translating the Latin phrase?
It means the thing
res
itself speaks.
ipsa?
The thing itself speaks.
The thing is
The
what?
thing itself speaks.
The thing
It is what it
itself
is.
speaks.
It is what it is. Like
it is what it is.
It
Okay.
speaks, right? If imprisonment is universal to the human condition, then that's a pretty strong indicator that this is a prison reality. I mean, you can make the argument that it's metaphorical, but it's just circular argument, right? Because
Yeah.
and I think we've talked about that in other spaces.
Yeah.
We've talked about that if a metaphor taken to if something is metaphorical but it's taken to the same extreme,
Of course. So like the the argument that we're in whatever form in a prison thing isn't it's just the argument of like,
Right.
oh, this is the natural state.
Mhm.
That is a logical contradiction, because the definition of a prison is that it's an abuse of the natural state, or at least it's a contrivance of the natural
It's
state.
the
right?
natural state inside the reality overlay. I mean, that's what the argument would be.
Of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
Of course, in a prison, the prison cells are the natural
Right,
state.
and we reproduce it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's become so deeply ingrained in us. It's part of us that we become the jailers. So let me give you another example. And again, I know this isn't something people like to hear. However, this is all, based on the data, Morgan's data and the data of other remote viewers and the historical clairvoyant data. This is all in our minds, right? In a very physical way, right? Where we're connected. So the source of this reality is our collective brains, right? Wired together in some way. And that is in the data. Having this shared dream. So instead of pantheism, right? Instead of the idea that everything around us is God in a different form, what would be more accurate in this case is panhumanism, right? Everything around us is human in a different form. So when we talk about issues like ethics around the treatment of animals, which is something people don't like to hear about, right? Well, that was something that was part of, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, early Christianity, right? Zoroastrianism. That is an important point to them that we no longer pay attention to. However, they would all argue that that the way we treated animals did have an effect on the fate of our souls. Now, if what we're saying is true, if the data is true, then they are us, right? So your cat, right? It may not be a human being, but it is an egregore of some sort that exists inside the minds of human beings, right? It's not separate from us in any way, shape, or form. Nor is the pig on the table. Okay, and so that would be
I'm following you, and I'm not even disagreeing with you,
right. So
right?
that's the ethical position there, and that again shows like how where they got the ideas that they have about ethical behavior towards animals and other people. And so that would be the data set as far as like what is the ethical behavior that would signal non-compliance and non-cooperation was universal at that time. So we have we have evolved a different understanding. I would say it's rationalizations and justifications, right? But there is a universal data set on that, right? So then you go back and you say, well, what did they all agree on were the things that you shouldn't do? And in the inception of all of these ethical religions of escape, philosophies of escape, escaping the situation of being imprisoned, they did not look like we live today, right? That they did not have the idea that we could live the way that we live today, because people did live similar. I mean, they were much poorer, right? But there were people who were interested in wealth, right? Building their wealth. There were people who were filled with lust, right? Or the illusion of longing, as they would have called it back then, right? There were people had evil
And
machinations, right? Those were universal things then, right? They're universal things now, and so that
and
yeah,
JT, I'm largely sold on the
yeah,
moral
yeah,
framework
yeah.
you were
Right. What I'm saying that
the,
is it's the data set though. The data set is the list of um is the list of injunctions described by people who claim to have these experiences in the past.
and I'm not even, it's not even that. My question is about the data.
Yeah.
Where's the, like, if I, whether somebody, whether a moral framework
Hmm.
or view being portrayed is accurate or not,
Hmm.
when it's being enforced by enforcers that don't appear morally
Hmm. Hmm.
superior, it doesn't make sense to me that a morally superior argument would make a difference when the
Hmm.
entire system is a corruption of power.
Well, that's what the
So,
corruption is, right? So
But it's
that's
also imposed, right? The
correct. So that's
corruption
what
is
the
imposed.
corruption is, right? So there's no, so that's where like what Morgan's focus would be. And that's where a lot of like the viewers get kind of stuck, right? Is the unfairness of it. But
But
the
I'm not
question is,
stuck at the unfairness of it. That's
no,
the
okay,
part that
but
resonates with me.
I get you. So the question is, how do we get out? So the answer to that question is not like this is they don't have the moral standing to make judgments. That's not part of the answer.
I agree. That's
Because
not part of the
yeah,
answer.
right.
You're
So
not aligned with.
the answer is the balancing of accounts, right? We don't have that specific information from Morgan. So we have the historical data points. We have the data points from former, or previous historical claircognizant movements, and from, you know, religions founded by individuals who had those experiences themselves, right? That's what we have, and hopefully we're going to have more direct RV data from now. But when it says like what is the balancing of accounts, that is what the balancing of accounts is reported to be.
And
So you have to
so
prove to people who don't have a moral standing to judge you that you're not actively, willfully participating in their experiment. You're not
because it
benefiting
just
from it.
becomes like ineffective. They're like this. We're not able to corrupt this person.
I mean, that would be speculation, but I would tend to agree with that. I would tend to agree that the people who get out are people who are discharged for being useless to them.
Right. So
Right.
the approach is Martin Luther King's wear them down with your ability to suffer in the morally virtuous sense, right? Like you don't perpetuate the vicious cycle
Right.
of
Yeah.
passing on.
And a lack of attachment. Right. I mean, so one thing that is in the data, I think it's pretty clear in Morgan's data, right? But other remote viewers came forward in our first space, not our space with you, but our first space where we did a practice space before we went on with you, right? And you know, they said, look, the majority of people don't have to be cajoled. The majority of people, when they go through that experience, okay, because as I've said, like this is common knowledge amongst many, but not all, remote viewers in the remote viewing community who conceal this information, which is what getting it on the record was all about for me, right? And in that way, you and I have a common passion for disclosure, right? But we just have something different we're trying to disclose. Okay, so the majority of people are going to rush headlong into the light. It's not even a trick. They've adapted to this scenario. They're all in, right? We're talking about the people who don't want that fate, right? Which is a pretty awful fate if the data is to be believed. But the majority of people, like moths to a flame, they just want to go back again. So
Yeah,
that's the difference, right? So yes, the people who get out are people who aren't invested. If you're invested, right? Personally, if you have a personal investment, you're not even going to make it to the point where, most likely, right? This is speculation, but based on the statements of other remote viewers who've worked these targets but haven't disclosed the session data to us, you're not even going to make it to the point where you balance the accounts, because you're going to, of your own volition, right, run right back in looking for the things that you were seeking when you were here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I
and
mean,
and
that's their data. I don't know. You know, I mean, again, like I that's a lot of targets to run. I would like Morgan to run them all, but I can't. You know, he makes money doing this, and I'm not independently wealthy. If I had $1 million, believe me, I would be tasking them to run all these targets constantly, right? But all we can do is sort of work for the information that we are given, and be grateful for that, right? Me, not you. I'm saying me. Like I'm grateful for that information.
no, I am too, and I think whether people are aligned with it or not, they want to hear it and they're curious about it. No, and I can't even. I know there's something I wanted to say, but I don't want to derail you off of, because I liked how you guys were presenting it. So I'm not trying to take over here. I really was just wanting to make sure that.
No. You know, this is this is old hat, man. You're like you're a made man in the spaces. I've told you, like you know, luckily no one from UFOX is going to pay attention to me because I'm not part of UFOX, right? And that's the whole thing.
Well, I mean, you're kind of a made man when you start. I know you don't like this word, but when you start talking about the soul trap, whatever you want to
Yeah,
call it.
well, okay, yeah. I mean, they remembered that you were part of that space, but when I showed up, they didn't even know who I was. But that's, you know,
Just learn to become a little bit more offensive, and that problem is solved.
I know. There's someone called Topacabra that apparently everyone yells about, and I guess I
I
just
never
have to
heard of
begin
him. Yeah,
by
I never
yelling
heard of
about
him.
Topacabra for like 3 minutes, and then
No, Toop is an amazing space host.
oh, Tupa, okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. I just hear people yelling about him. I don't know, man. Um,
I mean, that's when you hear if you hear somebody yelling about somebody, there's a chance that it's the opposite of the light. You should at least figure out for yourself. You
right,
don't.
but
But
you
yeah, no.
are.
Toop is an amazing space host. I don't agree with him on everything.
I've told you this before, right? And you are the. At least I said it in text, right? You are the abbot to every Costello in UFO X space. Every time I turn on um, one of those spaces, and I start listening, and if there's someone that's going to come forward who maybe isn't ideal, um, maybe isn't very good at framing their argument, or maybe doesn't really have any idea what their argument is, they address it to you, right? And you very patiently attempt to have that one-way argument with them, even though I think everyone else knows that they have no, it's just a disaster. Like their whole um, monologue is just disastrous, right, for them. Um, and that does give you a certain status. Like you're, I think, the most notable individual in the spaces community that I'm associated with. So
oh,
it's just
I'm
natural for
definitely
you to sort
not.
of take, just sort of run with
No,
it.
I
I
mean,
think we understand that.
no, I think that's very kind of you. I'm definitely not the most notable, but we definitely all have a role to play, and you guys have left a mark on people, and people want to know more. And I think that's really what we need. We need like I think you understand mostly, but I really welcome um like disagreement that doesn't need to be resolved, right? Like disagreement requires more empathy than agreement. And I'm much more terrified of two people who think they agree than two people who actually understand where they disagree and they're not trying to change the other person's mind. Like I want sexier, healthier disagreement that doesn't need to be resolved. Because we have so many lies, and unless you overlap all of the lies, you're not going to figure out what's truth and what's lie. And it's easier to figure out what's lie if you listen to everything than to figure out what's truth by saying like, no, I'm not even going to hear that, right? So that's why I'm saying I like your casual like easing in to this subject, and maybe call me psychopathic, but when you hear Morgan's trepidation in his voice and you beating around the bush for the first hour of the space, some people were DMing me. They're like, just spit it out already. And I'm like, no, let him cook. This is good because it shows that it's had an impact on you. It shows that you're not getting your rocks off from delivering some doom. People are hearing that you're not delivering the data that you want to believe in, whether it's true or not. People can hear that, and so we need to make it easy to disagree. You know, so yeah, I'm enjoying this, man, and I really don't want to derail. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure
I'm with
we
you.
get those
I'm with you
images.
100%. I think where I was, the part of the rant that really sort of set things off was the manifestation rant. And specifically, the reason I go on rants about that is because I'll talk to actual remote viewers who have seen this stuff firsthand and who then say, yeah, we're trying to figure out how to manifest X, Y, and Z after having seen all of this in pretty close detail. And if you understand like what this reality is, if you understand this reality is an aggregate of us, um, and it's inside of our minds, and it's we're being manipulated for an external forces benefit, then this manifestation thing, right? This is making a deal. So if you're getting something back, what are you giving in return? Like what's in it for everyone else, right? And that part is speculative. However, I can tell you that, as taboo as the subject is, the perspective of esoteric Buddhism and esoteric Christianity, as elaborated by the theosophical pioneers of the late 19th and early 20th century, and Rudolf Steiner himself, who all attempted to circumvent the question or obscure the facts, right? The core issue for them in um, the creation of the reality overlay and the maintenance of the reality overlay, and the reason that we are trapped in the reality overlay, was what they referred to as black magic. Now, I don't think what they referred to as black magic is what people today can think of as black magic. It certainly wasn't black magic as they described it, and their descriptions of black magic, what they consider to be black magic, um, were somewhat technological and somewhat akin to the concept of manifestation. And they also specifically talked about the actual reality overlay being, built out of people's minds, out of their heads. Right? They were very they were very exact about that. Specifically, the archon most responsible. They're talking about him removing substances from people's heads, and also introducing thought forms and
Can you go
ideas.
deeper into that? Because I could be
Yeah,
wrong,
yeah.
but I think 90% of the time, and I think we probably understand each other more than I realize, but most of what I'm asking for is something rhetorical, and I'm not actually criticizing and trying to interrogate something epistemic or ontological, right? And I'm saying there's something about the storytelling that I'm just sharing with you, whether it's reflective of the audience or not, that I want more of. And I'm suggesting here, like, you probably have people who want to go deeper into the weeds. That most people's questions here are probably about, even if you don't have clear answers, like most people want to know like where the rubber hits the roads. Like personally, I'm brimming with questions like, what do you mean pulling stuff out of the mind? What's the technological stuff? Like that's interesting. Like I wouldn't assume that a paraphrased or a cleaner story is really what people are longing for. Like I want the messy shit.
And so, specifically to that, I didn't mean to say people's minds, out of their heads, out of the physical brains of the people involved in people trapped in the eighth sphere, which is their term um, for the reality overlay, for the simulation, right? So traditionally, as I was mentioning, right, the seven spheres, the seven heavens, the seven planets, right, were something that one had to ascend through in order to escape during the afterlife, from the perspective of ancient pagans and early Christians of the Gnostic variety, and they were referred to as aerial toll houses. However, while the soul system is something we see out there, it was only being used as a metaphor. What they were saying is that there are levels of reality, which Morgan refers to as density levels, on top of us, right? So, like 7 to 13, he doesn't have a number. I'm just that data is coming from the ancient Gnostics, right? But at least 7 planets stacked on top of each other that we perceive as a solar system, but that's metaphorical for the way that it actually is, where you have these levels of densities stacked one on top of each other. And the ascension process isn't a flying through space, it's an actual upward sense of moving out of a pit. And Morgan has a picture of it. I don't know if he has it to put up in the nest, but he has a drawing of it coming in the session work. Um, However, we are not in those 7 spheres anymore. We're in the 8th sphere. We're in an artificial reality constructed by these archons, several specific archons leading the process, and it's constructed physically by connecting our brains together, and that is the drawing out of the brain. Actual brain matter is being drawn out of the head. on base level reality. So the thing about that makes that interesting isn't like the horror of talking about it now. It's the fact that someone was talking about it in 1919. And the mind aspect of it is they're trying to build this reality overlay for specific reasons. Now, we can only speculate about those reasons aside from the battery and the bioengineering. We know that they're using people's batteries, and we know that they're using human tissue for bioengineering purposes. That's some of the tissue they're removing from people's brains. That's in the data. However, we believe that just like in the real world, an experiment is going to be made useful in as many ways as possible. When you have a data set, you're compiling a data set, you want to pull as much data out of that as possible. So we find people talking about the data actually being saved on computer disks. Right now, that showed up in Sasha's pole shift sessions. Right. And she's like, well, it's like almost like a computer disk. Yes, that comes up in people's sessions where the data that is being generated here in the reality overlay is being stored on a physical medium in base level reality. So they're getting more from us than just harvesting energy battery wise or feeding off of loosh. They're also
They're
using us.
getting the whole, yeah,
Yeah,
they're using
yeah,
the whole buffalo, and
sure,
you and I,
yeah,
we're the buffalo.
right. And
And
you know what? Like Morgan and I were talking about, we're like, we bet maybe that some of the shit that we're inventing in here, it's real. It's real out there. We're inventing it, right? Wouldn't you use the computational power of what is basically a supercomputer, a super quantum computer, composed of a bunch of people's heads? Wouldn't you use that to come up with all kinds of stuff, right? So they're trying to build this simulation in a way that makes their experiment most effective. And to do that, they are introducing false images. And this is one of the reasons that they don't like to talk about the eighth sphere. One of the reasons it's so taboo is because remote viewers and clairvoyants can be targeted to bring back false data. Right now, that doesn't mean it's all false. And it doesn't mean, like Morgan will tell you how you can train so that you don't bring back false data. Right. But less well trained remote viewers and clairvoyants in the past could be manipulated to bring back false data and then to introduce that data, right, as ideas and visions that they saw. I saw a vision about this. And by introducing that vision into the popular consciousness, it's like a meme or a computer virus, right? It constructs the reality of the reality overlay from within by convincing everyone that something is true. This is all in our minds. So if you can get somebody to say, like, buffalo or purple, you said buffalo, right? So if you could get, hypothetically, the way that you would introduce that is to introduce it as images into the minds of the brains of the people who are networked together, right? And there would be some sort of system wherein that would become a meme and catch on. One of the things that I've talked to other individuals about and remote viewers about is, and you may be very well aware of this, right? Human consciousness and the way we think and perceive has changed. And it has changed within the last 3,000 years. Now, it's probably changed quite a bit previous to that. Okay. But there are things that we know about the past that most people don't realize. Like, for instance, we know that the Greeks did not see the color blue. Now, it's going to sound weird, but it's true. They did not see the color blue. They didn't have a word for the color blue. They described the ocean as wine. The Egyptians did have.
wine red is how the
Yeah.
blue ocean
Yeah.
was described.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
Right.
and to this day, to be fair, cognitive scientists still don't know if we're dealing
Right.
with a physical level of color blindness or something that
Sure.
translated through
Okay. But
perception.
you're
Right.
familiar with Julian Jaynes, right? Janesianism. So
I'm familiar with the concept that you're
okay,
talking
yeah.
about.
So just for the people who might not be, right? Julian Jaynes said that the way that the hemispheres of our brains related has changed, and the evidence for that um, is that when you look back in like ancient literature and art, you don't see first person perspectives. You don't see introspection. You don't have people say, I thought to myself, you shouldn't do that, but then I did it anyhow. There's no inner monologue represented in art or in literature. And in fact, those, what we consider now to be a normal way of thinking and writing about thinking, didn't really fully materialize until Shakespeare. So, we can't say with absolute specificity, but the complete absence of evidence seems to be evidence that people were not thinking, their minds, their brains did not work the same way in the past that they work now. And what he suggested is, when you do look at ancient literature and art, you find that people were receiving a lot of commandments from gods. They weren't talking about inner moral, like when they were talking to God, they weren't saying, like, oh, I was talking to God, and it's a metaphor for like their inner monologue. They were saying, like, I heard a voice. They were hearing these voices sort of all over the place. And what Julian Jaynes said was that he believed in the past, our right hemisphere communicated to our left hemisphere through hallucination. And what people thought they were hearing gods, they were actually hearing one half of their mind, giving them instructions. And that as time has gone on, that has changed. We no longer experience those hallucinations, but some people still do. And that's where mental illness comes from. So that's the Genesian perspective. However, there is evidence that we have changed. The way we think has changed during that period. And if one looks at the reality overlay, the reality that we experience is metaphorical, then the physical changes that may occur or may have occurred could very well be a metaphor for that process. Right? So they're trying to build us, like we're a work in process. They're trying to develop us into something, change the way we think. That's in the data. Change the way we think. And we could be seeing that without realizing what we're seeing when we look at the evidence of history, archaeological evidence, etc. So that's that process of sort of manipulating the reality overlay from the inside by manipulating individuals with false
Totally.
imagery.
And JT,
Yep.
I don't want you to cater this entire space and the rest of the space to
Yep.
me. I just
I
wanted
know.
to
I'm
just share.
rambling, repeating myself. I understand that.
No,
Aaron has
I'm
his
not
hand up.
saying
Okay.
that. I'm
Yeah.
saying I want you to stick me in the vat, and
Yeah.
continue making your voice, Morgan's
Yeah,
voice,
dude,
and other people on stage.
you're a big boy, dude. You can stick yourself in the vat. If you want to go in the vat, go in the vat. Right?
I'll
You want
stick
to stay up
myself in the vat.
Okay. Aaron.
Yeah, what's up, guys? Thanks for
Yeah.
hosting the space and having me up and everything. So, what were you saying? The last thing you were just saying, the ways they've tried to craft and cultivate our minds or perceptions over time. What have you found from the data, and even especially with your specialty in astrotheology and astrology and different dynamics, on different cultures, maybe certain Mayan cultures, or I mean, pick some famous ones, but other tribes or cultures around the world over time that seem to have, through a reincarnation birthing process or a genealogy or a way of living or something, are there any of those that you've seen that stand out to be kind of their own breakaway civilizations, if you will, from that construct, while still living simultaneously on Earth with the rest of us?
Okay. Just to be clear, hold on. So you're saying, are there any specific groups of people who have evolved at a different rate or developed at a different rate than everyone else?
No, not even
Like, do
necessarily
we see the
evolution.
evidence of individual experiments with like cultural groups?
Yeah, not even evolution, just a sovereignty, I guess. Certain, tribes or bloodlines or people that have kind of kept themselves outside of this construct with the space dicks and whatnot. You know what I'm talking about? Like they have their own kind of reality. What's your data and experiences or thoughts on
Okay,
that?
yeah, no, that's a very simple question to answer, actually. So the data that we work from, the intuitive underground data, which we then use as a Rosetta Stone to decode previous clairvoyant, claircognizant data in history, says that we are physically trapped in a very real prison with our heads physically wired to some sort of device at base level. So who is and is not still alive outside is in question. They believe that very few people are, and that most everyone was wiped out during previous to and right around the time of the creation of the reality overlay. There may be people out there, and I've asked them when they can to target the environment around the facility where we are, because they've isolated an actual facility, an actual large structure with a large underground area where we're being kept, right? Based on their data. And I've said, well, can you look around and see if there's any evidence of civilization? They feel that there probably isn't. However, to me, maintaining a structure like that bespeaks infrastructure, right? You need parts and materials and fuels and wires and bricks and people to put it all together. So I have difficulty believing that all of it was brought via space shuttle from a mothership.
Yeah.
Right?
Just
So
briefly.
the answer would be none. The answer would be none. So the answer would be like, no group of people alive in the world today that you or I are aware of are outside of the reality overlay. Everyone is in it, right? Because we're all lying in cells next to each other, and we're not here. We're in a cylinder.
Okay, and then based off of, I unfortunately missed the first hour or so of the conversation, and I noticed it's not recorded, which is a bummer. So I would have definitely gone back and listened. But
I forgot to record it. That's inadvertent. All right,
if you're lucky,
that just screwed this whole thing. That just screwed everything.
If you're lucky, there's some
Go on,
avid
man.
listener in here who's been screen recording the whole thing. So if that's you, please send a copy to the host and myself. I would love that. So I'd love to hear this whole thing. But I think based off the 6-hour dialogue in the Fringe and Doomer space last week, and based on what you just said, so do you feel like there's a physical location on Earth or in the Earth or under the water or somewhere here that's actually projecting the simulation we all live in right now? Is that what you're saying? Like a core group of player characters, basically?
No, that's an important question, right? So that's the first thing, and this is difficult sometimes for people to set what I'm saying. They think it's parsing, but it's not on Earth. The term Earth traces back to the year 1400 or so, right? So they definitely don't use the term Earth. Earth is the simulation. And that's important because we assume that it mirrors them completely, but we don't know. So the planet, which comes up in data as being called Terra, which makes sense because that's what it was called in Rome and Greece, right? Terra may be identical, or it may not be identical, or a mirror image of where we live. There could be important differences that we'll never perceive directly. Yes, there is a facility that they found where blind remote viewers will report the facility. They'll describe it as a very large building that sort of looks like a cathedral with an underground complex underneath it, which some people refer to as a dungeon. However, it's, if you can imagine, like a deep underground or multi-level, very large underground space. And it would have to be, right, obviously, to have a lot of people in these tubes to conduct an experiment of this size. But yeah, they see it. They don't know where it is. We don't know if we can ascertain where it is physically or not, because we don't know if it's identical, right?
And do I remember right from last time? Maybe it was just numbers you guys throwing out hypothetically, but is there anything with the data that says like the core number of player characters, if you will, versus NPCs or simulated characters and what we're experiencing on Earth? Is there a number for that?
Not in any data that I'm aware of. However, okay, so this is an important point. Thank you, because I wanted to talk about this. Okay, I talked about the concept of NPCs, and I said, I don't think there are 8 billion people involved here. I don't think that there's a space that large, and I don't think, there's just a number of reasons why I don't think the 8 billion people are involved. So I tried to discuss NPCs, and at least one person wrote a critique of my using the term NPC. And what they said was that we were referring to dumb people and we were dehumanizing others. And no human being should ever be referred to as an NPC. So I want to be very clear, like I tried to explain earlier. Instead of pantheism, if we're inside a reality overlay that's occurring in our minds as sort of a collective dream, then we would be inside of a pan-humanism situation, whereas everything is us, right? So NPCs would also be us. They might not be a person, right? But they're people that exist in everyone's minds collectively, right? They're
Would,
tied into an actual biological and right. It's a dream we're all
yeah.
having.
Yeah, and
Right.
would it be, I guess in that framework, maybe this time I might be butchering a terminology for analogy or metaphor here, but so if like maybe some of the core players, not to dehumanize people, but on the planet, whatever that number is, they have more of a full or complete neural connection or soul fragment, whereas the NPCs aren't just soulless automatons or figments of our imaginations. They're also here, but they carry a smaller percentage of the main core drivers of this construct's like persona or
Yeah,
fragment, I guess.
right. I mean, so that would be speculative. I can tell you what the ancient Gnostics said. They said there were three types of people. There were that's where the word psychic comes from, actually. So there were pneumatics, psychics, and hylics, Hylek, hylics. Hylics were purely material beings, purely made of earth, without a soul. However, as I pointed out, if the earth in question is within our minds, then that doesn't dehumanize them. It would make them sort of like a collective multiple personality, basically. So I don't know if they would have a portion of soul. The psychics are the people who we would be talking about, like who know, sort of know that there's something up, but are tied to the simulation. And pneumatics are people who it means blown in, and it would be people visiting the simulation if that was possible. And we don't know. There's no data from like remote viewing that says that's possible. However, well, no, actually there is, but there's no direct data from remote viewing on that subject that I'm aware of. But it's certainly something that the ancients were all in agreement of. So it is possible that both ways, right? We've talked about the space dicks themselves could be coming in here through some sort of VR and messing around. And perhaps that's why we find these revelations of like, people in our ruling class who are supposedly doing very, very evil things that make no sense. And I said, well, consider the things that people do when they play Grand Theft Auto, right? Or something like that. If you're in what you perceive to be a game, then you could do some pretty horrible, terrible things. So that might be what people are talking about. That could be the root of this whole like demon possessed reptilian ruler class. I'm not saying the Archons are reptilians, I'm saying as a metaphor. But also there could be people who are incarnate, who those would be the pneumatics, and it would be difficult to say like if they're wired. They must be wired in some way, but maybe not in the same way, right? So yeah, most people would be NPCs from the perspective of the data, I think, just based on the size of the facility, right?
Yeah, and I'm with you on the NPC thing. I know people that there is a balance that would need to come to that. Obviously, if you took it to the extreme, then it would allow certain people to feel like they have the right to murder or harm other people that we physically interact with as humans because they're convinced they're actually an NPC, and that doesn't benefit anybody at all. So I totally appreciate the nuance that you're bringing to that dynamic. With the Gnostic perspective, would you say that? I mean, because I've read a lot of the Gnostic texts, and it picked up things as cross relates to Christianity, Catholic history, a lot of other history and shit. But would you say the goal of the Gnostics, or part of it, was bring the Gnosticism, the knowledge and the awareness of that we live within the demiurge or something created by a demiurge that poses as a god, and it's more of like waking up out of the Plato's cave thing, at least to understand there is some form of personal or collective pleroma or something beyond the space sticks. And that seems kind of be a decent summary to me of what the Gnostics are trying to communicate. Would you correct that, or how would you say that?
So we don't have direct data about the pleroma yet, as far as I'm aware. However, Morgan does have data about the source versus the origins of the universe. And the origins of the universe data, correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan. The origins of the universe data is the data that involves the creation of the reality overlay. which I was supposed to mention to Doomer Daddy. We don't know if it encompasses the entire galaxy or not, and it is a physical place. It's a device, a reality emitter device, actually, tied to this experiment. So there is some sort of device involved, like specifically. Yeah, I think the Gnostics did want to. I mean, well, I know the Gnostics did want to escape matter. What matter won't matter, right? Which is not really matter. It's the reality overlay, and did want to escape this trap and return to the pleroma. And I think that Morgan's data and the data of other remote viewers give us sort of an idea of what the pleroma could be, which, you know, I would let him talk to if he wants to talk about that, about the source of reality. He might be smoking a cigarette or something.
Well,
you
you
go.
kind of have to with
Yeah, you do
something,
kind of have
right?
to. I agree.
I mean, let's be honest here. Yeah, no, okay. In terms of actually, pleroma is that's actually a fairly new concept to me that was actually brought to my attention by JT. So I would kind of hesitate to really comment on that directly because I don't feel that I personally understand that concept well enough to really relay how or if and how it actually relates to the data that we've come up with. Now, one just before I forget, I'd like to jump back just a couple of minutes here to the idea of external influences kind of popping in and out of again, just talking colloquially here, the simulation. So very early in my RV career, I had heard well, my instructor, my primary mentor at Dames, he had talked about the idea that with some let's just call them UFO targets that he's worked, they had come across this concept that seemingly physical craft that, you know, by visually and in many cases physically leave, you know, evidence that they were a physical construct. You know, that you can sometimes you can see marks on the ground, or sometimes there's even a radioactive signature where these things have apparently landed. And he had, you know, repeatedly over the years, they'd come across this concept, not in every single case, but in a significant number of them. When they tried to trace these things back to their point of origin, they really couldn't do much better than the idea that these were material items that had been constructed or assembled out of local physical materials, like almost as though they were sucking the elements like carbon and whatnot out of the air and being constructed almost instantaneously on site to serve their purpose, whatever that may be. And that their ultimate controlling authority was, in fact, some external intelligence. And, you know, earlier in my life, in my own cosmology, and I think probably in Ed's as well, I will never pretend to speak for him, but you know, we kind of took that to mean that, oh, okay, this, you know, this is effectively a, you know, highly advanced civilization, maybe in this galaxy, maybe in another, somehow doing this remotely through technology. Well, we have in the years since then, we've come across. I can think of one very specifically, but there have been other cases that I'm forgetting some of the details of, but that actually showed us, yes, very, very much the same concept. However, now with all this kind of new information, it actually seems more likely. And again, I would never, speak in exclusively, you know, universal terms that this is always the case, but it really seems to fit that, in fact, some of these localized, locally constructed and interactive phenomena are actually, the remotely controlling intelligence, maybe it actually isn't from this galaxy or another. Maybe it is actually from outside the simulation. So there is that, and that, again, that ties into, the idea of these things or people analogously putting on a VR headset in order to interact with us, influence us, and do whatever the extent of their activities are. And I also want to make a quick comment to your other point, about the, again, colloquially, we'll call it a breakaway civilization. And, I think it stands to reason that, conceptually in base reality, probably there are those who went along with this experiment far more willingly than others. So there's probably a fairly great range in that. And does that extend into the simulation? Quite possibly, if not probably. So I think there's definitely something to that. I just kind of wanted to point that out.
I have another question. When I popped in, I just heard the tail end of the phrasing standing before the Archons and telling them, I do not consent. What led up to that? Yeah, can you give me the backstory on that dynamic?
Sure. That was where Doomer Daddy tried to run in to rescue me as I was ranting about rape whistles. All right. Because I get going and I take on my my native persona as a Bostonian. So after we did our Doomer space, there were some people who ad-libbed on the subject, seemingly in reaction to our space. And I'm sure there were a lot more who did it, and I just never saw it. But I saw a few people and a few accounts. One in particular that had like 25,000 followers, and did a detailed thread on how to get out of the soul trap without seeming to have any actual knowledge of how it worked. And I asked them to respond, do you have any source material that you're basing this information on? And they didn't respond to me. And I did, say, look, if you don't have source material, then posting this is extremely unethical. They didn't respond to me. So, they don't have to, right? It's X. People can just say things without expecting to have any accountability for them. Whatever. It is what it is. Yeah. So the idea they said was this is all consent based. And that's where I got on my rant, because like what we do, right? One of the problems with accurately conveying past data and the worldview of people who lived a long time ago is that there's been a tremendous consciousness drift. Like the assumptions that we have today are very different than the assumptions that someone had 100 years ago, never mind 2,000 years ago. The way we think about things is completely different. And the way we think about things has changed in my lifetime significantly. Um, I was young in the 90s, and I can tell you that, we didn't think about a lot of things the same way that we think about them today. We certainly didn't have that model, the consent model, which is something that I'm not criticizing the model, nor am I saying that it's, it's wrong. I'm saying it's a good idea to teach young people about consent, but the whole sort of like, it's a metaphor, right? Where you use human physical interaction and you take that and use it as a metaphor for explaining life and reality. And you could do that like inside, um, you know, or in this case, they took that metaphor and they projected it onto the idea of being prisoners in a prison planet and saying, well, it's not binding because it's only binding if you consent to it. And all you have to do to get out of it is withdraw your consent. And that's where you came into the picture, where I was saying, we have this life review and you're standing in front of these archons who are judging you about whether to recycle you or not, or let you go. And you go into a rant about consent. Unless we have data points that support that, that's probably not the strategy that you want to take in that interaction, right? You probably don't want to strategize that you're going to go and face these archons, do the life review, and your argument is going to be, I don't consent to this. You have to let me go, right? That's how people should treat each other now in 2025 in the reality overlay, right? It definitely, I don't consent to you touching me. Okay, I'm not going to touch you. That isn't binding to as far as we know, okay, isn't binding to non-human intelligences and archons and etc.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. I totally appreciate you filling me in on that. And I'm not familiar with the thread that you were referring to, but it does bring into my own, into view my own internal and personal framework through. I mean, I would say probably my entire life I've been awake for the most part. I mean, even though I was born into a Judeo-Christian dynamic and a Christian church dynamic, and spent the better part of 30 years in that, I was very actively engaged for what's the truth, like biblical apologetics, actual biblical history, studying all the texts and the ancient texts and reference sources, and in the later years expanded that out to, all texts, extra biblical texts and world texts, and, the kind of the synthesizing of the messages from all of them, not just one place. But however, through a Christian paradigm framework, there's someone I came across. His name's Dan Duvall. He's become a Christian minister over time, but he's worked with a lot of, dozens and dozens of abductees, people from the Montauk program, survivors of MK Ultra, the SRA, the extreme stuff, and gone through the wild ass stuff that a lot of people would just dismiss even hearing, which, you guys can probably relate to some of the remote viewing. A lot of people just dismiss that as whatever the reasons are. Obviously, you've seen enough data to see the consistencies over time, the validity in the actual process and machinations within the ability, the actual legitimate ability of remote viewing. And so, like, seeing these people's experiences, one of the things that he crafted over time were these prayers. He's got dozens of them now, of different prayers of this being that there's being something significant. This is outside of any religion, but there's something significant to humans inside of a body, inside of this place and time, with our own level of awareness and agency, to be able to make multidimensional declarations over our soul contracts, over our reincarnation patterns, over things in those dynamics. And outside of him in the Christian frameworks, which those prayers are still fantastic, super effective. I've posted about them before, but there's also ones that are a-religious. And that concept of in any given life, this is the one we're all in listening to the space right now, but within any given life, coming to awareness of these, multidimensional dynamics and samsara and all of this, to be able to find moksha and dharma, if we're going to use Eastern terms, to be able to break free from that wheel of incarnation. So it's not like something we just wait till we die, but it's something we actively engage and anchor in now. And so this is anecdotal. I might give you, prayers and things that other people have done, but obviously none of us really know. It's not like we've, even with near-death experiences, how much weight can we put on that? Because we experience something in a multidimensional realm, in a sense, and we're bringing it back to a very carnal, sensorial realm. It's the same thing with trying to, deliberate people's experiences on psychedelics versus soberly, and to be able to parse those nuances, because there are tools of perception, but also how do we integrate that back into an everyday life? And so I feel like I've seen a lot of validity in my life and other people's lives from taking more layers of sovereignty, agency, self-responsibility just for anything that's happened in this life or that you've engaged in, or multi-lifetimes, and recollecting it all into like a sovereign stance now, and like this time and awareness in these bodies, that ideally we have progressive levels of confidence that when we die or transition, there's already a lot established in our personal this lifetime avatar psychology, but also like a multi-lifetime remembering awareness that we can navigate the realms outside of this body more freely than those who haven't even given thought to these constructs. And like you said, they just naturally are going to go to the light. That's, billions, if we're considering all 8 billion are actual humans. That's billions who are going to do that and to each their own. But for those of us who are listening in this unrecorded space and engaging our curiosities that way, it seems to me, or maybe this is hopeful thinking, that we do have some form, in some way, shape, or form, more control over our own sovereign individual journeys.
Well, thank you. That was very comprehensive. I think you represented your beliefs well. I just so that because I know you came in late. I am a Christian. I believe that Jesus incarnated into the reality overlay. I believe that it began prior to his incarnation, and I think he came here to save us from it. I believe that this is Hades. I think another word for the reality overlay is Hades. which is one of the three words that are conflated together into the Bible to be hell, which are really three separate states. And yeah, I certainly hope that he's right. And I'll tell you, one of the marks, I think, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but I'll tell you, like, one of the marks of somebody who genuinely like perceives what's going on, and is here to help, or really wants to get out, is that they love the neighbor like they love themselves, which is right what we're commanded to do as a Christian. I'm sure that you know that that's the fundamental command of the New Testament, right? And of course, in Buddhism, for instance, it would be compassion, to have compassion for all beings. I hope that even if I'm trapped here, right, I hope that other people get out. And if this isn't hell and there's a hell after we die, that's worse. And I'm destined for that. And I'm not saying I am. I'm saying, but if I were, I would still want you to not go there. So I hope that that's true, and I hope that um, those work. I don't know of any data that supports those ideas, and I myself am skeptical. And the reason I'm skeptical is, and I'm not saying this is about you, but generally speaking, people who make those arguments to me aren't people that really live, who walk the walk from a historical perspective, but sort of have a modern middle American conception of the Christian life, which doesn't show up in the data as far as I understand it. But you know what? If it works, if you can assert your sovereignty and get out, um, more power to you. I hope that you all do. So that's what I got to say about that. I wanted to touch on two quick things before we go to other speakers. And that is the size of the simulation. We don't know, or the reality overlay. We don't know. Like, we're talking about planet Earth, right? Or Terra, right? The reality overlay being planet Earth, but you were talking about gaming, and I think that's a good analogy. We don't know the size of the game environment, right? It could be all of Terra, or just part of Terra, and we're hallucinating the rest of it. Like, maybe none of us have ever been to Greenland. I don't know. I think so, but I don't think, I think that you can go to Greenland, but we don't really know. To speak like really solace, you know what I'm saying, solipsistically. But Mars, the whole solar system could be part of the same reality overlay. So when we talk about extraterrestrials, we could be talking about extraterrestrials outside of the reality overlay, or we could be talking about a facet of the reality overlay itself. And that could be either a distinct population or simply a projection of the dream, right? So one of the things that we see with cryptozoology, and I know people don't like to think of aliens as part of the cryptids, but technically they are, right? One of the things we see when we pursue a lot of these cryptids is we'll see evidence for them, and I'm speaking we in general, right? Evidence for them, but then you can't find them, right? And just like there's distinct evidence, as Morgan was pointing out, for the existence of UFOs, but when you really look, we just assume if anyone is finding them that information is classified top secret, because we're not really able to do it. We can summon orbs, right? But as far as I know, no one has set off an independent search for an alien homeworld or an alien base in the system, gotten there, gotten some information, intel, and come back to report it. So they could be projections, or they could be, like Morgan said, they could be avatars for individuals outside of the reality overlay as well. And then I wanted to say that specifically, I don't want to elaborate on all the data behind this. There's a story, there's data to it. I think that people will understand that in our day and age, with people who aren't reasonable, and are capable of doing some extreme things, that regardless of who or what we're talking about, we definitely wouldn't want to dox anyone specifically, right? And we definitely wouldn't want to name a name of an individual and say, oh, this individual is, possessed by the devil. Like, we wouldn't want to do that, right? Because whether it's true or not, we would then be responsible, hypothetically, for the chain of events that occurred after that. Rudolf Steiner was very certain that now, today, there would be an archon incarnated on planet Earth, and I have access to, previously in my life, data points that would tend to suggest that that is the case. So I believe we have evidence of at least one individual who is pneumatic, who is not was not part of the experiment, who is here. We can speculate that there are more, but as far as the actual specific data is concerned, there's data about one individual, and that individual is involved in doing some work to try to keep people stuck here, very intentionally. Yeah. So again, I don't want to articulate. I don't want to get too much. You can think it's like just me spouting off or whatever, but I do think we have some evidence of that. I've attempted to get some remote viewing data, which I certainly wouldn't release because again, I wouldn't dox someone, to confirm it. And as of yet, I haven't been able to convince anyone to run the session. But at some point, I will, and I'm pretty sure of what we're going to find. Yeah. So that's what I had. Now, who's next to ask a question?
Can we just pause for one quick sec here? This is probably as good a time as any. I just wanted to just give a quick shout out to everybody listening. Thank you for participating and joining us here, Aaron. Mind Your Business, Fletcher, Fringe, Doomer, Direct, Justice, Matthew, Mr. Moses. Hey, by the way, I see you've jumped back down to listener, but if you want to speak more, back up. Blue, Sally, Joshua, what is it? Punished Bateman. Diogen de Sainan. Although I'm Canadian, I don't speak French very well, as you just witnessed. Q Kelly, Matthew, James, Hoddle Meow, Chris Zazula, John Castillo, 42, Jerome with the awesome, I'm assuming that's a Coolio profile pic. That's amazing. Gally, Bark Like a Duck, Lou, and 4 other listeners that I can't see. Anyways, just want to say, hey, hope everyone's having a great day. Yeah, anyone else that wants to speak, you're more than welcome to request the mic.
Just to jump in real quick, I know Fletcher and we got mine up here waiting too. Just based on what you last said, not wanting to name anybody, and that's totally reasonable. But part of what I was saying with the hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of going through the experiences with these MK Ultra, Montauk, different SRA victims who've been subject to this, a process has been going on for generations. It's multi-generational of trauma-based mind control dynamics. One of the things that was consistent is that they were not on one of the processes, because it's not just like one experience you have and it's over. It's repetitive over time, depending on who's doing it to you. They have different agendas, and a lot of them are tapped into different space dicks, basically. And so they get their soul fragment bound with these different entities. And so part of these prayers and things free them from these entities, from their influence in different ways. And so anyway, I just think that speaks to additional evidence to what you're saying of like certain ones being intentionally connected into different archonic overlaying grids in various ways. And I think there's a lot of diversity there from what I've seen. It's not as simple as one straight up bad guy. There's a lot of them.
That's true. There's one straight up bad guy that is here full time. But channeling, I believe.
Not here in the space.
No. It's not Morgan Farrell.
It's Elon Musk.
He's listening. It's not Morgan Farrell, and it's not Doomer Daddy, because I know that's where everyone's eyes would look next. No. Listen, people channel these beings, and it comes up and it's reported as a positive thing. So that would get into like naming a bunch of stuff, and that would also involve like possibly talking about other people in the UFOX community who are in favor of that or participate in that like channeling behavior with these specific entities, individuals. And that would sort of get into the airing of the grievances zone. And I don't really have any grievances. I have been advised to generate more controversy, but I'm not there yet. So we'll have to save that for like a future space. But yes, there is communication, in my opinion. And that's just based on pattern analysis, because similar traits pop up between the channeled beings and the beings reported in the RV data and the historical data. Like uncannily similar. And I think they generally claim to be the same oftentimes, right? So there are like councils of beings that channel who claim to be the ancient Egyptian gods, which are the archons, right? So, yeah. Next question, anyone?
Yeah, hey, yeah. So first off, thanks for having me on stage. Thanks for holding the space. Thanks for being a good sport about continuing, even though it wasn't recorded. I know it can be demoralizing, but you took a slide tackle and kept on playing. So bravo, that's real sportsmanship. I had a question because you brought up the map and kind of not having a lot of clarity about the map. I guess this is maybe more of a speculative question then, but there's no, I mean let's start with the less speculative side. Based on where your beliefs are right now, and so with that disclaimer, your beliefs and not what's borne out by the data that you've been kind of getting reinforced with the assistance of other people, but where your beliefs are right now. What credence do you lend to kind of the flat Earth understanding of there being a firmament and there being kind of a much more established map that looks a little bit more like how you might, when you mentioned being a kid in the 90s, you might have a very finite, fixed world gameplay for the map versus having it be a much more open, and if you know about game development, more procedurally generated, expansive, open world design where we can see things at a certain distance, and then as there are members of humanity that go and actually explore, it does become a sort of a canonical part of the map that we can then actually go and occupy.
That's one of the evidences of simulation, right? But we don't think we're in a computer. But as far as the evidences of simulation, that is one of the evidences that we've had repeated periods in human history where we speculate that things exist, but we can't prove they exist. And then when we develop a means to look closer, then we see them where we didn't see things before. And that's actually a subject brought up in a book called scientific, the structure of scientific revolutions. It's a very real thing, not just like on a cosmological scale, but actually on a scale internal to the reality, over like close to us, where the greatest experts in the world will look at an experiment or will perform an experiment and not see the correct data, and then later on everyone will see it. And so how could they not see that information? It's self-evident to us now. And this is something that has, it's been a long time since I read the book. I can't quote from it anymore, but it's definitely something that's always been the case. As far as the map, yeah, I'm going to blow your mind here. And I'm also going to summon, Morgan, forgive me. We have an individual on X that we're a big fan of, but we have a fundamental disagreement on the nature of reality. So oftentimes, not just Morgan and I, it's a group of us. He is a more successful. I'm not an influencer. He's an influencer. He's successful, and I'm sure he's a great guy. He doesn't really have time to talk to us, though, right? Because there's nothing in it for him. I'm not saying that, like, look, I'm sure he's a great guy. I'm not, for the best reasons, he doesn't really have time to speak with us, and we wouldn't really. He's a love and lighter, and sees this as an escape room, as a form of corporate training almost. The reality overlay. His name is Jordan Crowther, and I love Jordan. All right, I don't agree with him, but I love him, and I respect what he's done. Like, he's really become very successful. Jordan produced a map, and that map was his map, supposedly. I don't know. I have to take him at his word. I don't have any reason to disbelieve him, but we only have his word on this, right? He produced a map. I have a copy of it someplace. I don't have it to throw up in the nest right now, and this isn't being recorded, so it'd be wasted anyhow. Of his map of reality.
Quick note on that before Jordan's map, just to let you know,
Yeah.
just because you said that. Doomer DM me. This is being recorded.
Okay.
Somebody did record it from the beginning,
Great.
and it will be posted afterwards.
Hey,
so
great.
just so you know.
Cool. Thank you. So,
It's safe to presume that the NSA always has a backup copy, as well as other Five Eyes friends. But I'm just saying,
yeah.
lists upon lists, turtles all the way down.
So, and I'm gonna I'll cut to the chase with this. His map of reality from his astral body travel. He went to the Monroe Institute, went to the Gateway program. He practices astral body travel. I don't know if he practices RV or not. He does, I believe, use the term RV. I'm not positive about that, but sometimes people who astral body travel do. He has made a map of the of space, of the area around the Earth, of the reality overlay, the simulation. He calls it the simulator. And as soon as I saw it, I recognized it. The map that you're speaking about is actually from the Nazis. That's what it originated, and it was a projection of the hollow Earth on the lunar surface, and that has become the map of the flat Earth, with the different continents on the outside. And people argue, if you look at the moon as a projection, a plasma projection of the Earth, that you can see our continents in the center, close to the center, and then you can see the projection of the other continents. I don't think that's accessible to us. I think that we're locked in a globe. However, his map, the one he made from astral body traveling, is virtually identical to the Nazi projection map of the hollow Earth on the moon that has now become the flat Earth map. As far as like the shape of areas and their location relative to the central globe. And so it is quite possible that that Nazi projection map could be a map of the reality overlay itself, but not areas that are accessible to us. So not a flat Earth, and but something different, right? Something like the map of the reality overlay, which doesn't have to work on rules like that. It doesn't have to be round or flat. It can be something else, right? It can have more than one area that, or hypothetically, right? I would just assume, right? Because you're talking about games, everyone's talking about games. Think of all the things we could do about programming virtual environments, right? And if this is a dream, the rules are even looser. So that's the answer to that question.
Well, and I'll just add real quick, for what it's worth, any time that I have been tasked a remote viewing target that would show us Earth from space, I have, and not just me, others that I currently and formerly have worked with, never have we come across any indication that would point towards flat Earth. It's always depicted as spherical as one would normally assume.
Right.
And further, same with the moon. The moon, again, myself and anyone I know that's been tasked against it, it's been described as a physical thing, not like a hologram like some people think. Now, without trying to overly convolute things, as we kind of alluded to earlier, there is a holographic component apparently involved with the moon specifically, but that's not to say that the moon itself is a hologram or what some people think it's like. I don't think they really even understand the words they're using, but they refer to it as, a plasmic body or something like that. No, it's been very, very physical, and more or less in terms as you'd think of it, cold, low atmosphere, rocky, dusty, etc., etc.
So let me articulate a little clearer. I would say that it could be potentially a map of the astral plane, whatever the astral plane is, right? So they definitely don't see, right? What Morgan's saying, like, I've never heard of a remote viewer who's seen a flat Earth. But this could be a map of the astral plane. I mean, I think that's what he said, from his,
Okay.
whatever the astral plane is.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask a follow up question on that vein then. With the understanding then, and we'll just continue. Now that you both kind of reached consensus that you would both agree that it's a map of the astral plane in which you do perceive that there is volume and mass to the Earth, whether it's a projection or however that's constructed. When doing the remote viewing exercise and being tasked against viewing back at the Earth, that your perception is that it contains volume and mass. I'm wondering, on the outer extremes of that experience, then, have you been tasked with, or within your network of known trusted viewers, and do you know who's been tasked with kind of pushing their perception all the way to the edge of the current known universe. Because we do have, the Gaia archive that has a pretty extensive, at least, list of stars. So you could at least have a name or a number for that target. And then additionally, you've got, of course, the ephemeris. Now, that presupposes that you trust JPL to be telling you the truth. And rather, A, that they're publishing anything that has any substance, and that B, you trust that you're gonna be able to actually see something when you go to the endpoints that they have published. That's a lot there, but yeah, I guess there's a guide there.
Yeah, I mean, I have an answer to that. It's not a lot. I don't know what Morgan would like to say though. He's a remote viewer. I'm not a remote viewer, so if he has something to say, I'll let him answer first, and then I'll tell you what I know.
No, it's a great point you raised there. Geez, I'm trying to think. The quote unquote furthest out that I've ever been tasked, in terms of physical distance. Oh boy. No, I don't think I've ever been specifically tasked against, a distant star, like a named star or a numbered star or anything like that. That might be an interesting thing just to test it out, and like we do with a lot of targeting, just test it out, see what comes out of it. So maybe at some point we will do that. Me personally, I have been tasked further out than the moon. And I mean, famously, Ingo did his Jupiter probe in, I think, 1973. Plenty of viewers have viewed Mars. I was tasked against, I think, is it Titan, Saturn's moon Titan, and again, I reported that more or less exactly as described. A large body of water beneath a frozen surface. So from my own experience and experiences that I've read about and have been relayed to me by viewers that I trust, at least everything within the solar system, appears to be, physically as you might imagine.
So that's kind of what I'm wondering about in terms of the two styles of, say, like, again, it's a horrible example, but it's a ready one. But video game design and the way that video game maps can be procedurally generated or generated on demand for open world designs. And I mean, now we've got at least a computer science understanding of how we can be replicated, how that can be replicated on our computer systems. But the sort of video game where, for example, the map is only rendered when there's an observer that dares to go into that area of the game. So that's kind of why I'm asking that question. I'm wondering if there is a requirement, maybe to actually to help flesh out these areas of the maps with genuine substance, that there be a conscious observer to go and look at them.
So there's a couple of things. The first one is, according to our data, we're imprisoned physically in pods, right? Cylinders. And this entire reality overlay is in our minds. Specifically, our brains are networked, they're connected together with some sort of wires. And this is a collective dream we're having. So even if we went to the edge of the universe, it would be the edge of the universe that existed inside of our minds. However, in my experience, I've been following the remote viewing community since the early 90s. Well, right around when Ed, I think it was 95, so the mid 90s, when Ed started SciTech and started appearing on radio shows. And I follow it as closely as I can. And I like to look at as much session data as I can, because I put things together and I try to come up with a normative vision of what people are reporting back. The problem is, as Morgan could elaborate on, I don't know if he wants to, because we go through this on every session, but the training levels, there's a wide disparity in the training that people get. Even some of the more popular remote viewers may not have received the same level of training that Morgan and his team have received. That's because they trained with a specific individual who had a very specific technical remote viewing training system. And he was the individual who used to manage the project when it was with the government. And other people have trained with either some of the viewers themselves from the original Stargate program, or second, third, or fourth generation viewers. I'm not discrediting anyone's abilities. I'm not discrediting anyone as a remote viewing teacher. What I'm saying is that specifically the issue that seems to come up is the ability to tell reality from fiction, because you can remote view fictional things just as well as you can remote view actual things. There's another layer to this. One of the reasons that we're in this reality overlay is because human beings, whatever we were on base level, were naturally intuitive. And the reason that we have this data is because people are capable of remote viewing outside of the reality overlay. So remote viewing itself within the is part of the collective dreaming process, but it's not limited. It's not a function of being in a reality overlay. They're not remote viewers because they're in a game. They're remote viewers. We all are to some degree outside of the reality overlay, and so they can see things outside there. So if you were to start tasking people to look at stars, and the stars here were an accurate mirror of stars out there, I would think it would be difficult to parse whether they were seeing things inside inside the reality overlay, or things outside the reality overlay. However, if you want more information on this, remote viewers tend to be shadow banned through Google and YouTube, etc. You'll go to some of these remote viewer sites and they'll have 300 followers, right? It takes a long time to build followers, and the people have to build them outside of the algorithm itself, because the algorithm buries the sites, in my opinion. However, if you look at Google, you're not going to find them. However, if you go to Yandex, which is, I don't know if I should be recommending it, because it's a Russian, it's a Russian search engine, and it's probably part of some sort of psyop operation or something. Who knows, right? We're in a conflict right now. However, they don't filter remote viewers through their search, or filter them out. So if you look for videos from remote viewers on planets and other solar systems, you won't find them, in my experience, looking through YouTube. But if you look through Yandex, you will find them, and you'll find quite a few of them, maybe 50, 100, maybe more. And the people they describe other planets, the civilizations on those planets. They describe wars and politics and species, and there's no way for us to tell if there's no feedback. So there's no way for us to tell if that's analytical overlay or not, if they aren't, imposing science fiction themes on something, if they're actually hitting the target, right? However, if you're interested in that idea and you're willing to look at the data that they're getting, regardless of whether it may be on target or not, you can definitely find it there.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that. So, I mean, I'll just say, so I definitely didn't hear you recommend that I use a Russian resource, but I am a fan of VPNs, so I think I understood the assignment.
Aaron.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask based on something you said, and I'd love to hear Fletcher speak. He's always got great insights. You mentioned the stars, potentially, if we share the same stars with base reality, basically. Do you think that's the case, or do you think even the stars are all a part of it? It's all just part of the simulation that's totally different than base reality?
Well, Morgan would have to take this from a data standpoint. I think that from what we understand, this reality overlay is a mirror of actual reality. Like I said, there could be differences that we're not aware of. Like, for instance, terror might not be identical to Earth. It might just be close to Earth. But our assumption is that the experiment would yield more data and be more valuable the closer it was to actual base reality, right? So you're going to try to get the most out of your data set as possible. That's probably including as much real world data as possible would probably give you the most bang for your buck. You get the most information from simulating different scenarios, and so it's quite possible.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes perfect logical sense, right? I mean, you want to get as close as possible without waking people up beyond that uncanny valley barrier, right? Where which is I'm not sure the term originates, cinema or media, But basically, when you're creating a movie or an AI generated image, something, once it finally passes the uncanny valley, you no longer intuitively sniff out that something is off here. It's so real, we just accept it at a very subconscious, unconscious level. So yeah, it would make sense that they would set up a simulation to get the most data accurate feedback as possible by making it as close to reality as possible without too many people being set off by tripping that uncanny valley.
Right. I mean, I will say one thing they see is they see that base reality is not very heavily populated, if it's populated at all. So that may be a situation where they're not able to make the data set, because what the data seems to indicate is that the space sticks got rid of everyone. Around the same time they started this experiment. So they wouldn't be able to simulate it. Now, I'm not 100% certain on that, right? That's some data, but I don't think they've run a lot of data. So I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't true, because as I pointed out, like the size of the facility in question and the level of the technology, the amount of machinery involved would tend to suggest infrastructure to me. I don't think, even if you had like 3D printers materializing atoms out of nowhere, I just would have to imagine that it would be tough to build and maintain a facility of that size without any population. But I could be wrong, right? I'm just talking I'm just talking off the cuff. I'm not there.
Yeah, I can't say with any specificity, but I would say almost certainly yes. There is some semblance of civilization in base reality. The extent of which the temporal or technological relationship, or how close it is to what we're seeing here, that at this point is virtually impossible to say.
Quick question on that data set, because maybe you guys have addressed this already, but I had somebody ask me in my DMs as well. With remote viewing, what's your personal process, Morgan, when you're reviewing the data or engaging with these teams or doing it yourself? How do you filter out things that are maybe being fed by the archons themselves? Like, how do you filter out which is like true data recollection and potentially manipulated, especially when you're operating on a non-physical level?
Yeah, valid question. So, I mean, ultimately, until we receive feedback, of course, a target cannot be verified until we've received feedback. Now, that said, I have privately received feedback on these targets, what we're talking about here today, quite specifically from a number of different sources. And, I'm just, to be perfectly honest with you, that at this point, that's the best we can do. The very best we can do is use viewers who have a solid track record of hitting the target when it is verifiable, and project that level of accuracy forward when working against unverifiable targets. Now, again, to me personally, I do take the feedback that I've received, because I've received it from people that I very much trust as solid sources, very solid, and it's been a virtually a more or less a total match. So I'm just being perfectly straightforward with you. That is the best that we can do. If we can come across further validation, I'll go with that. If for some reason, I'm convinced that our data is invalidated, believe me, I'll be the first one out there to say, hey guys, we were wrong. I don't anticipate that being the case. That's more or less really all there is to it. Now,
I was just going to say that makes sense.
1 sec, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. Sorry, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, what you said so far, and please do continue, makes sense. If you would start with people remote viewing physical locations that can be proven, right, and they've proven their merit over time, different remote viewers you work with or people in teams, and a physical location, then that obviously gives additional validity to unprovable tangibly, right? We're talking about archons, metaphysical realities. Like that, it gives more validity to the accuracy of their information when they go beyond. There obviously would still need to be more discernment in certain ways or deciphering through the information because you can't physically validate it. But that certainly seems like a logical stepping process. But please continue.
Oh no, and just further to that point, that is exactly what we do. You know, when we're working operationally, it's not at all uncommon for the project manager to slip a completely unrelated and standard training, or we would call it calibration or maintenance target, um, in there amongst the unverifiable stuff, just as a means of ensuring everyone is keeping sharp. And in fact, I actually had our team run a series of calibration targets prior to our last kind of foray into this end of things, just for exactly that reason. And they were all quite satisfactory. So again, that at this stage in the game, I think that is the best we can do, is just be diligent, keep on top of things. Yeah, and which we are pretty diligent in ensuring that is the case. Because at the end of the day, the last thing that I would want to do would be to go out there, claim some wild shit, and then find out, oh well, our team isn't running very well, so how reliable is that data? So no, we're very careful about exactly that. Now, I just want to mention here, if JT, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had a hard out in about a half hour from now, so I want to make sure that everyone that wants to speak gets a chance before we.
I wanted to do a little housekeeping for a minute. Actually, I wasn't certain whether I was going to hold this space, and I got a question on a thread from Sally, who's in the audience, about further details. And that question, because believe it or not, a lot of people were talking about the space, but no one was really talking about us. Well, no, not me. They were talking about the viewers. Sorry. There's my ego, right? They were talking about the viewers. They were talking
I'm okay
about
with
humor.
people not talking about me.
No, they weren't talking about me, right? And so no one was really asking me any questions, and she did. And so I said, okay, I'm going to have this space. So Sally, I'm giving you the opportunity to speak and ask questions if you'd like. I know that it's like I get fear from public speaking, so I know it's hard to have someone put you on the spot. You may have no interest whatsoever, but if you have any questions, feel free to come up over the next half an hour and ask them, so we make sure that we cover what you're looking for. All right, go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah, no, that's really all. I just want to make sure that everyone that wants to hop on the mic has a chance to. And I see Fletcher's been sitting for a while, so if you got anything to say, man, please feel free.
Yeah, sweet. I listened to probably the first couple hours of your previous space, and I was really enjoying it. But I got a lot of family stuff going on, and I caught you again on another drive, so I'm pretty stoked. What you guys covered was really encouraging to some of the stuff that I've been kind of looking into, and I'm not doing it scientifically or anything like that, but a lot of things ran parallel, which really surprised me. So a couple of the things that I'm wondering about in your data has to do with archaeologic structures and the archons and the descriptions of them. So one of the things that I've been wondering about here is, like, just for example, just kind of looking at everything that everybody's talking about, and the pyramids, everybody keeps saying they're older than we thought, and then with the pyramids comes along some sacrifice type stuff, especially in South America. And we're talking about soul harvesting here. And when you find a bunch of bones in the bottom of a pyramid, and they're trying to figure out how it works and what it did, and finding old stories about how the days are longer now than they used to be, it kind of makes me wonder what these things were for, and if it is related. And then also back to the moon. So one of the questions that I kind of threw around to some friends initially, kind of jokingly, was, okay, well, you know, if there's people out there saying that pyramids are old technology and we don't need it anymore, maybe, you know, maybe the moon is the new technology that they're talking about. And so that's kind of where my brain is at. So I'm kind of curious about um, what you saw, what you guys saw, or what the data shows with these ancient archaeologic structures, temples, pyramids, sacred structures of any kind, rock
Sure.
circles, fire arena for all I care. And then the archons, what were like physical descriptions that they had of these archons? You know, did they look like Hindu statues or what?
Last question first, because my memory isn't what it used to be. Descriptor of stocky came up. A remote viewer not associated with Morgan's group said they're very veiny. They have veiny heads. I don't know. That's only one remote viewer. I haven't seen any other data. There's a surprising lack of data on their appearance. However, what did come up in Morgan's data set was that they were concealing their appearance. And so that very well could be why there's a lack of data about their appearance. As far as ancient structures are concerned, once we realize that we're in a false reality, a reality overlay, time is out the window, right? So time is out the window for a number of reasons, but just like a video game, because we've been using the video game metaphor, right? You can design a video game in an old world, right? You can design a video game on Earth that's 14 billion years old, that has 80,000 ancient civilizations, and still there's a day one when people, it's like the creationism, people who dismiss creationism. They say simulationism is creationism for nerds, right? Anyone who could create an entire reality can create an old reality full of ruins, full of bones, just as easily. Now, it seems as if there have been, this is where it gets into like speculation. It seems as if there have been some kind of reset, right? I know everyone is on this mud flood thing now, and I'm not making a Tartarian argument, but I personally think that the Mandela effect, I don't like to use the word timelines because I don't think there are various timelines. However, I think that there probably are resets, and I think that in lieu of past lives, which is how we perceive it, past lives, that what we're probably experiencing are different dreams. And so the resets are sort of like the end of one dream, the beginning of another. This is my opinion. And it seems as if there are incremental improvements being made, so that originally this was sort of a out and out prison, right? Philip K. Dick called it the Black Iron Prison. And I agree with his thoughts on this subject pretty much 100%. And that it has been modified as time goes on. These lives that we have are being modified to make this a place that we don't want to leave. We're less likely to want to leave, a place where it's still as much suffering, but has an appearance of comfort when we're not directly perceiving the suffering. So I think that those ruins could very well be like part of the reality overlay where people lived and walked around. As far as time goes, we don't know. Hold on.
Well,
We don't know what time we're talking about. However, there is a sort of a confluence of events in history about 4,000 years ago, between 2700 BC and 2000 BC. There's sort of a confluence of events that seem to match up with things in the data sets, including the flood myth, which is recorded in, as you know, 37 civilizations or more, and talks about everyone but a few people being killed off, right? So I would tend to suspect that anything prior to that may mirror previous, may mirror the outside world more, and anything following that period, this is my personal opinion, is probably something that has developed inside the reality overlay itself. That's what I got.
yeah, no, that's great. That all tracks. Yeah, I'll just maybe try and make it a little more succinct and clear. But basically, I'm looking at this from kind of more of a cosmological, astrological viewpoint and specifically gravity, right? So like the Schumann resonance frequency does not match up specifically with the circumference of the surface of the Earth. And it's like a little off from where it should be. So like, I guess my thinking is like, are there structures, artificial structures that are creating artificial gravity that may be like limiting our perception by like dropping our perceptual abilities down like a whole dimension or two, so that we're actually living
So
in a higher dimension,
okay,
but
no,
we're not able to perceive
so
it.
we're living in capsules in a basement, in base reality, right? And living is taking liberties with the data. So we're, when this you find this in the Apocryphon of John, the first and primary Gnostic text of the 2nd century, where it describes us being put into this situation. And you also find it in the viewers' data now, the viewers, remote viewers all over the place who look into this subject, and you'll find it in the data of claircognizant, clairvoyant movements in the past. So as far as what the Schumann resonance is, like, could it map internal structure in this hallucination? Yeah, sure. However, I think that once you accept that this reality is an aggregate dream inside of our minds, then a lot of things, are both physical for us and metaphorical at the same time. Archetypal, metaphorical. We look at lightning and we have the metaphor, for when we have an idea or a number of ideas, we say it's a brainstorm. And I would reverse that metaphor and say that perhaps the lightning itself is a reflection, symbolic of the processes of our minds working collectively together. I think the Schumann resonance, this is my personal opinion, regardless of how it works inside the reality overlay. My sense is the Schumann resonance is the closest we get to a physical manifestation of the collective unconscious. A tangible, emergent, archetypal, visual, because we can see, we don't see it, but we can see it in our measurements, reflection of the collective unconscious. That's my sense, and I do believe that this is going to sound weird, but ancient cultures thought this stuff as well. And I think the lightning is metaphorical of actual processes in our brain. And I think many things are, right. So we were talking about the pole shift in our doomer space, and the previous doomer space, Magic and the Noise, Sasha, she was talking about the our minds being wiped during a pole shift, and like a magnet wiping a hard drive, and the information being put on what she said is metaphorically like a disk and put on a shelf. And I don't believe it's metaphorical. I think that the pole shift is the internal representation of an external process of wiping people's minds and starting over, at the very least. That's what I have to say.
Cool, thanks, man. And also, I love the word space dicks. That's awesome.
And that's Morgan.
Oh, God.
Oh, it's fantastic, bro. I got to second that just audibly. It's fucking fantastic. It really is. Space Dicks is great, man. It adds a little bit of humor to some really heavy shit, and it's super true. It's fucking great.
Oh, can I do it? Sorry, one more minute of housekeeping before we do our last 15 here, or 20. I'm trying to get, there's a gentleman who is a regular in UFOX. I don't know anything about anyone's reputation in UFOX. I don't know anything about UFOX drama, airing of grievances, personalities, social interactions. Like, I'm not part of that community, and that's not generally what I focus on anyhow. He seems to have quite an expertise with the Mayan calendar stuff, the Mayan dream spell stuff, which was really popular leading up to 2012, and then sort of lost popularity. But it's actually very elaborate information. Whether it was concocted by some new age or not, I don't think so. But it's very elaborate, so I don't think so. I think it is actual traditional information. That's my sense. And they apparently had information about the simulation or / reality overlay as well, which he mentioned in a space I was in. So I've invited him to come on next Thursday as our guest. His handle is Chan Votan. And again, I don't know anything about personalities. I only know that he definitely knows his shit about the Mayan dream spell material. And it's an area where our understanding is lacking. Someone was asking like how this might be represented in different cultures. We know some, we don't know all of them. So I'm actively seeking out individuals who have expertise in
Yeah.
other cultures, right? So I hope they'll be able to do it next week. And
Yeah.
I'll post it. If anyone has an interest, they can follow up, and hopefully that one will be recorded. So if you don't see it live, you can see it later.
Yep.
Or is he an AI? Oh, okay.
No,
Go ahead.
I've always liked Chan. He's always been cool. But also check out Hollow Cipher. He's a good friend, and his at Fractalverse. And he knows a lot about that. He knows more about that and the planetary cycles and all that stuff than anybody I've talked
Great.
to. And he's
Great.
usually my
Yeah, I definitely
go-to
will.
with questions like this. So,
Sure.
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll second Chan too. He's awesome.
yeah, that's the other thing.
Go ahead, Fletch. Yeah, go for it.
I just, as far as like the interpersonal stuff, I just avoid it. Like if I go into a space and people are talking about like other people or other people's business and like just gossiping, I just leave right away, and that seems to solve all the problems for me. So that's
Yeah, I
just
mean,
my opinion.
I'm not even trying to be critical. I'm just trying to differentiate that I don't have any of that knowledge. So if I did bring up somebody that there was something that I didn't know, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that I have no idea. I'm just basing it on like demonstrated knowledge, and based on that demonstrated knowledge, something that I do a little bit differently. And again, I've only done 3 of these, and I'm never going to be a doomer daddy, right? I'm never going to be like a known commodity individual. I'm never going to be a superstar or whatever. But people jump right into the conversation, or they don't handle, like, in my opinion, like the interviews often aren't very strong in these spaces when they do have guests on. It's really put a lot of weight on the guest, and that's not what I'm all about. So I would run the first third as like 20 or 30 structured questions, and then move on to free form. So if anyone's looking for like a deep dive in that type of material, then they would want to join us in that space, because I will grill somebody. Again, I will information mine like pretty deep. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, Chan's a great one for that. With his training with some original tribes and stuff, and his knowledge and his actual daily practice. It's not just stuff he's researched and just finds it interesting. He actually lives it. So I heard his name randomly while I was up here. So I figured I'd throw in my hat for just endorsing that. I think it's going to be great interaction. I think it's going to be awesome.
All right, what do we have? I'm at the bottom of my checklist here. Morgan, do you have anything on your checklist?
Oh, no, I don't think so.
Oh, the guy who went to the moon in ancient China is Wan Hu. If anyone's interested in it, one of the problems that we have, speaking of like cultures, there is a tremendous amount of written material in the Chinese language on Chinese history that covers like a ton of esoteric topics, but it is super inaccessible because there's no one who's really an expert in Cantonese or Mandarin or different dialects, the ancient versions of them, who is allowed to go over there and look at the material. So there's a lot we don't know, but that's rich. Like that is like very rich territory for information. I'll give you an example. John Vivanco, who he's a great guy, and I love Metaphysical, which is his podcast / TV show / remote viewing streaming service. And they did an episode on whether the Chinese had contact with the Anunnaki. Now I know that sounds funny, or maybe it doesn't sound funny to anyone else but me, but I was like, oh well, that's weird. And it turns out they did. And turns out there is a historical record in the Chinese historical record of contact with the giants from Mesopotamia with somewhat advanced technology. Now, at that time, the Chinese had advanced technology as well, according to themselves. Like they were traveling to the moon. I know there is a lunar rock in Tibet that is a memorial to that trip to the moon. There's mythology or legend or history of several emperors traveling to the moon. It's they built a base there called the Moon Palace, according to Chinese legend, and people lived there or may still live there. It's Morgan and his team did find a building there, by the way, but they found an abandoned building. One thing about viewing the moon is the same situation we were talking about with stars, which is, are we viewing it inside the reality overlay or outside the reality overlay, right? Because it very well could be crawling with extraterrestrials outside the reality overlay. It could be filled with them, but inside the reality overlay, it could just have an empty building on it. But yeah, the Moon Palace, and they were traveling back and forth to the Moon Palace for 1,000 years or something, infrequently. So yeah, that story is the Moon Palace, and it's Wanhu, Wanhu. If anyone has an interest in that story, it's around the same time. I had mentioned earlier in the space that Steiner, who was an excellent, I don't trust him completely because I think he had some ideological overlay. However, he was an amazing clairvoyant and predicted, as I mentioned, he predicted COVID 100 years early. So we talk about like some remote viewers doing it in 2017. Steiner did it in 1918. He had one archon incarnate around that period of time and live as the Yellow Emperor, the legendary ancestor of the Chinese people, legendary emperor, ancestor, ruler of the Chinese people. And that's right around, it's about 2700 BC. So it's within like 700 years of the alleged trip to the moon. So that kind of gives you an idea of, according to their own writing, the level of technology that Chinese civilization had at that time. I know that they had like machine guns, right? In the year like 1200 or something like that, and they gave them up. So there's a lot of information there that hopefully we're going to have access to someday. And I think as we go through culture to culture, expert to expert, we're going to find a lot of information that would be great to task viewers with to really expand our understanding of the details of what's going on both inside and outside the reality overlay. Does anyone have anything they want to ask, add?
Well, you said since you ended that with expanded understanding, that is literally the link in my bio, expandedunderstanding.com. So I just want to put that out there. I'm totally with you.
Okay. So you have a website on this on similar subjects, or?
Well, it actually just links to a YouTube channel I did with a very good friend of mine who we did 100 days in a row on a YouTube. We've got like 500 hours content on there. We've never minded it for micro content, something I've wanted to go back and do, but talking about all these subjects, it's a pretty broad spectrum. So
sure, because we only have 5 people involved right now, I don't post the link. Anyone who wants to follow me on X, I can post a link. I don't know if anyone would have any interest, but we do have a 5-person Discord server that we're hoping to build out, which will allow people to have real-time interactions outside of spaces on these subjects for anyone who's looking to collaborate on these type of issues, right? If someone has an interest in developing further understanding of the reality overlay or things that are associated with it or other topics we'll discuss, we're going to do topics on astrology. We're going to do topics on preparing for the end of the world and how to think about it. That should be the one after Chan Votan. I'm going to do a space about why people are fat, and I'm probably the fattest person in this space, so it's not a judgmental. We're going to cover all kinds of topics with the time that we have, like really focus on trying to get a lot of information out in the next 8 weeks. I just mentioned that, like, I'm not saying anyone would have any interest, but if anyone is interested in that, and working together, that option is available through that venue.
Well, and JT, if I remember correct,
go ahead, Morgan.
You've talked about at some point running a space on the concept of astrology as an analog simulation model.
That was originally going to be this week.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that one in particular. I think that's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, no, you know what it was? I was going to do it on Friday, because that's what astrology is. It's an analog simulation model, and no one understands that. I'm not going to say I'm the only person in the world who understands astrology, but functionally, in my experience, I'm the only person in the world who understands astrology, how it works, not as far as being able to make a successful astrological prediction. There are a lot of great astrologers out there, tons, but they don't understand how astrology works or what's going on. So we were going to do a space about that, but I got in there with Doomer and Fringe, who are amazing and always do an amazing job, and Morgan and Dan, and we put so much of our heart and soul into it that I was just wiped out. I don't have much endurance anymore, and I kind of was in an accident, and my mental faculties sort of vary from day to day, and my physical endurance varies from day to day. So I just the next day I had to cancel it. I couldn't do it, but we're definitely going to do it over the next 8 weeks. We're going to cover a lot of important information.
Well, to be fair, I very much find the same. Like running these spaces, I mean, it's amazing. I quite enjoy doing them. They are surprisingly exhausting.
It's true. It's totally
It's a
totally different.
it's a high engagement. It's a high engagement format. I mean, what Aaron was saying earlier about YouTube or the video podcast style. One thing that's really nice about that structure, and like Last Astrologer was saying, if you have 30, 30, 40, 60 structured questions, then getting through that in a much more tactical, way without having a whole bunch of audience engagement, then, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? It can help you conserve some of your energy, but you'll never get quite the same level of, I mean, you'll never be energized by your audience in the same way either. So, pick your poison. But I love that you brought that up. I didn't even realize that was something you were going to do. That was going to be my last question. Was about astrology in general, and it being perhaps maybe my terminology for it would be an artifact of the simulation, right? A very visible widget or lever within the simulation that, I don't know. It almost looks like it's one of the biggest proofs of the simulation, because,
Correct.
my God, by all accounts, astrology shouldn't fucking work.
Yeah, I mean,
It
look,
shouldn't.
you understand simulation model, right? We have the sentient world simulation in Indiana, right? In southern Indiana. Right? We all know, when we think of simulation, that's what we think of. And then we think of people living consciously inside that. But those computer simulations exist, maybe not as well fleshed out as in a science fiction novel, right? So an astrology is an analog simulation model. And there was an experiment. It was about 550 years in Babylon, when they were trying to figure things out, called ordinary watching, which was the scribes and priests in the city would record the stars and the information in the stars, along with information about what was happening in the city and in the world, and with the king. And it's the longest and most successful experiment in human history, right? But because astrology can be stigmatized, people don't realize that it comes from this prototypical historical 550-year long experiment, but it does. And we've taken that information and we've fleshed it out as time has gone on since. But that's what it is. These transpersonal patterns that we can't perceive directly, we can only perceive them when looking at the steady and predictable motion of the planets, because they're long-term patterns, right? So you need things that are going to be in the same place every 2 years, every 40 years, every 240 years, in order to become conscious of those patterns. But that's what it is. And as a matter of fact, I've often said we could really improve the quality of our simulation models, digital ones, if we were to include the simple astrological algorithms.
Oh yes, and
Well, if with your permission, what I'd love to do is just front run. I mean, I'll just come right out and say it. I'm a long-time content creator. I'd love to front run a little bit of that content by if you have time, getting some time with you to record some of that, or at least be within the Discord server, because you gotta. I mean, you had a hook in before now, but basically I'm very eager to know how more of your views on this topic, because I haven't heard people discuss astrology in this way yet. And I think you're right. You probably do understand astrology, unlike anyone else I've been able to talk to. And you're saying things that I've thought that I've heard no one else say. So I think this
Yeah,
is kind of a
that's why I talked about it. That's the invitation. I don't have a link. I don't know how to put things up in the nest, and I'm not directly recording this. However, if you follow me on X, I will post a link to the Discord server tonight. There are only 5 people in the Discord server at this time, and one of them is a nice man who writes fantasy novels, who doesn't have anything to do with any of this stuff, but is a devout Midwestern Christian. So he kind of just observes, and then there's me, Morgan, Dan, and my brother Matt. But we would be happy with 5,000 people. It's simply that we're just getting started. But I would love to be able to talk to more people about this information. I think Morgan, I can't speak for Morgan, but I think that they would like to do that as well.
Oh yeah,
excellent.
yeah.
Well, if it's okay, I'd love to put you both on a short list as far as some of that stuff goes. I mean, I'm kind of breaking protocol by doing more of the seeker and consciousness and versus reality and perception content, and now UAP because there's so much overlap. But I mean, there's an audience that knows me only talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They'll be very upset when I talk to them about anything else. So this is a whole different line of content. But it's one of the most interesting questions to be asking, I think, right now, and that you're pointing out. There's so much more to be gained in quality of life than just chasing shiny objects, whether they're digital like Bitcoin or they're gold.
Yeah, and I also have to I got to just point out that if anyone does try to follow me on X, I've never really been interested in being an influencer, and so for a long time I sort of had a policy of telling people to F themselves if they wanted to follow me. And I haven't taken that down yet, but I need to get around to doing it. So I'm just mentioning it because if anyone should say, "Oh, I want to follow," and then they look at it and it says, "You guys are NPCs. You can't even want to be better. Go F yourself," or something like that. I don't mean it. I don't mean it, and I need to change it. I got to change it tonight. But I didn't want to sabotage myself by telling you guys to follow me and then having to see that without telling you.
Well, as a perfect contrast, I didn't even read your description. That's why spaces are so valuable, I think. I've heard you talk, so I've connected with the things you've said. I followed you also, and if anybody doesn't know this, just so you guys know, for X, so only apparently on phones, not on desktop, but on phones, you can not only follow someone, but you can also follow all of their posts and or all of their posts and replies. So if someone's really active on X, you can kind of follow them around X and see how they behave and get a feel for a person. Anyway, that said, so just you talking before about Discord and stuff, said you're going to post it. I subscribe to all your posts, so I should get a notification when you post it. Yeah, count me in, man. I think
Cool.
the more we get to collab on this stuff and actually talk reasonably about it, and the more information is going to actually bubble to the surface that is collectively true and accurate. So that's awesome. I'm really glad you guys are doing that. That's awesome. I'd love to be a part of it.
And Morgan, he likes to do shout outs and to make everyone feel welcome, and that's something he's very strong at. But something he's not very strong at is remembering to say that he's Morgan Farrell, who, in my estimation, I consider him to be a paramount grandmaster remote viewer. That's the level I consider him at, and that's only something that I would think of because it's not a real thing. So it's just in my own personal opinion. That's the level that I put him at as a remote viewer, and I followed this for, I don't know, 30 years, more than 30 years, maybe, right? Remote viewing. And he has Morgan, what are your websites? Intuitive Underground, which is the canon material that we were talking about, intuitiveunderground.com. And Morgan, what's your website for RV training?
Oh, the the creatively named remoteviewingtraining.com.
There you go. But see, you
Yeah,
gotta
Morgan,
remember,
your SSL cert is expired, by the way. That kind of scared me off. If you want help with that, I send you a DM. I'm happy to help with that if you need it.
For on which?
On your website, it's lacking some security stuff that it needs.
Oh,
Like Google wouldn't list you
frig.
if that doesn't get fixed. Yeah.
Okay.
That could be,
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. A colleague of mine basically just kind of whipped that site together for me, and you're talking about the training site, I think.
yeah, the training site. But I mean, well, I'll hit you with a double whammy. Your SSL cert is expired, and you're still using Zoom and Skype. You really need to change that too.
thank
they're
you.
compromised.
Thank you.
JT hates Zoom.
I won't. I
He's
did
got
one
good
last
reason.
Zoom with them, and I told him I'll never do it again. I said, join Discord, or we're only talking through we're only going to write messages to each other. I'm not doing any more Zoom.
Okay, thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. I was generally aware that, yeah, the training site is in dire needs for a pretty massive overhaul, and I've slowly been chipping away at some updated material for it, amongst like a billion other things that I've been working on. But thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. I am interested in addressing that in the very near future. So I might just hit you up for a quick chat on that if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Very open to it. Very happy to help.
Thank you,
Aaron,
man.
do you have a last question?
Yeah,
So
last
hit my heart
question.
wall.
Yeah, and I know you guys are closing it down, so you can feel free to answer this question and wrap it up at the same time if that's what you want to do. Totally valid. How would you differentiate what many refer to as the astral realm versus the remote viewing realm?
I have absolutely no idea.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. That is something we could probably pontificate on for a long period of time. I'm not sure I actually have a real short answer for that. Myself not at all being whatever you'd want to call, like, an
You
astral
want
traveler.
to do a Discord about it, maybe? Just because I have to. I mean, I gotta bail.
Right. Okay. Sorry, that's an unsatisfactory answer.
Well, Aaron's going to join the Discord, right? So we'll be able to talk to him
100%.
about this
Yep.
stuff further. Yeah.
Okay.
So look,
No, that'd be a great topic. Yes, and that's my short answer. I'm not overly familiar with astral travel. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but not experienced. That's probably a better word. So, let me think about that, and we will pick this conversation up again at a future date.
Fringe, Doomer, Direct, Darren. I know you guys are really active in spaces. I'm sure everyone is, and I just don't recognize everyone because I'm not. But we really appreciate you guys joining us. And Doomer, I really appreciate your help earlier and trying to save me from myself, but also repping the space and repping our abilities, right? And and everyone who's here, right? We appreciate you, we love you, and we are your allies in this situation, right? Now, today, and going forward. And that's how I would like you to think of this relationship. All right, this space relationship. All right, and I will post that Discord information for anyone who would like to join. For these guys are really busy. They're paid professionals. I am not. So you'd be interacting with me more. But they will be around and available from time to time. All right. It's going to be like 15 seconds, I guess. I'm supposed to leave a pause. So everyone have a good night.
Cheers, everybody.
Be sure to follow the hosts and subscribe to their posts and notifications.
Thank you. We're not good at plugs.